The first action of the Manhwa takes place in a house full of aristocrats, and the Duke begs his wife to divorce him. Rosalina, the protagonist, is very angry at these words because their long relationship can end with a blink of an eye. Her husband even offered a generous monetary compensation if she returns the surname Fail Eden and returns to Brighton. The protagonist of the story looked silently and angrily at what her spouse had placed on the table. The girl's husband had laid before her a contract of divorce and monetary compensation for her to sign. Out of anger, Rosalina clutched her dress in her lap, asking her husband why he would only pay her 1,000,000 coins. Infuriated, the heroine shouted at her spouse that she was Rosalina Felsden herself and did not need any amount. Piercing her husband with her red eyes, the girl told him that he was still her spouse. While the heroine's husband angrily folded his arms and remained silent, Rosalind herself rose from her seat in anger, showing her anger. Angry at the Duke, Rosalind slammed the table hard, shouting to her husband that it all belonged to her. Out of rage, Rosalind threw her husband's contracts aside, yelling that she would not even sign them. Such was the story the girl read on her phone, thinking about the fact that the plot in it is completely predictable. The girl continued to stare at the text, thinking about the fact that Rosalina decided not to take the easy path. The villain of the novel the girl is reading is named Rosalina Felsden. She has a hard character and disposition. Throughout the story, Rosalind commits very bad deeds, because of which she is not loved by everyone. But because of a failed attempt to poison the main character of the novel, Rosalina has already been sentenced to death. The girl, reading the novel on her phone, continued to stand at the traffic light and think that the villain is a fool. Looking ahead, the girl realizes that on the one hand, it was just a novel in the phone and nothing more. But she continued to read it, already realizing that today is a rather unusual day than before. In fact, the girl only read the novel to distract herself from the messages about money debts. The girl had been getting a lot of messages reminding her that she would soon have to pay back all the money she had taken. She looked up, and because of the novel, she didn't even notice the fact that people had been crossing the road on a green light for a long time. Sleepy and tired heroine hurriedly crossed the road before the light on the traffic light showed red. Looking at the traffic light, she tried to get there in time, as the time for crossing the road was already running out. However, the girl never made it across the road because the inattentive driver didn't notice her right away. In the last seconds of her existence, she looked at the truck that was about to take her life. The girl's life didn't end there because she suddenly woke up to someone calling Rosalina. It turns out that Rosalina was being called by the Duke himself, not understanding why she suddenly stopped hearing him and hesitated. The Duke was still holding out the allegedly his wife's divorce agreement, but the heroine could not even realize who was in front of her. The excited girl remembers that she definitely could not cross the road because she had just been hit by a truck. In addition, the heroine of the Manhwa does not realize what she is wearing and where she is right after her death. The girl looked carefully at her hand, realizing that it's not her hand and the clothes are different, noble. Everything around her seems more colorful and beautiful than in the world where she had just been hit by a truck, where her life had ended. Looking at herself in the reflection of the window, the protagonist realizes that it looks like she has been reborn into someone. The protagonist realized that she now sees instead Rosalina Felsden, the villain of the novel she was reading. Remembering her character and history, the girl does not believe to the end that she has become possessed in her body after her death. In addition, the girl realizes that right now Rosalina's husband has offered her to sign a divorce agreement. Wanting to get into the situation, the girl begins to remember what happened in the novel when she read it. She recalled that her husband offered her to give back the surname Felsden and return to Brighton in exchange for money. The heroine also recalls that Rosalind herself reacted very negatively to this, and the agreement infuriated her. But the Duke still insisted on the divorce, saying that in that case he would pay her 5,000,000 coins. Returning to the present, Rosalind's husband grudgingly said that there was no point in them delaying. Looking at the heroine, the Duke said that if they separated, she would receive a compensation of 5,000,000 coins. The amount made the protagonist think about divorce because she wants to do something different from what Rosalind would do. Suddenly, Rosalind lowered her head in surprise, pretending to cry very bitterly. To this, the Duke reacted calmly and angrily, as if he was completely annoyed by his wife's behavior. Getting up from his seat and coming closer to the heroine of the Manhwa, the Duke told her that there was no point in crying. Rosalind's husband even leaned over to her and honestly said that her tears don't affect him at all. It turns out that the heroine blushed with happiness, realizing that thanks to 5,000,000 will live in wealth. Remembering her past life, Rosalina realizes that by the standards of Korea, it is 50 million won, which is a lot. However, the evil Duke continued to threaten his wife with divorce, telling the heroine that everyone should have their place. Unexpectedly to himself, Rosalind stood up and with a happy smile told her husband that she understood him. She even asked him where she should sign, while the Duke did not understand his wife's abrupt kindness. Rosalind signed the contract for divorce and monetary compensation, easily drawing her signature on it. The sudden agreement surprised the Duke, causing him to look at her with surprised eyes. After signing everything that needed to be signed, Rosalina gave the documents to the Duke, leaning them against his chest and saying that she had done everything. Immediately afterward, she rose from her seat and began to walk away, telling her now ex-husband that she had done what she had to do. Out of shock, the Duke anxiously looked through the papers, checking to see if his ex-wife had really agreed to them so easily. The Duke stared dazedly at his ex-wife, not realizing what had just happened and where she was going to go. But the heroine was already leaving the mansion, asking her ex-husband if he thought she would behave differently. After lighting up her former spouse with her happy eyes, Rosalina said that this is the end of their relationship. The girl's words made the Duke even more surprised because he never thought he would hear this from her. At the end of the manhwa, heroine waved her hand and said goodbye to him, already going to leave the house and get into the carriage. After that, the doors to the mansion finally closed, but the heroine did not think of going back there again. She calmly and happily walked down the corridor, thinking that now she would return home to her family. The pink-haired lady walked out of the castle, where the coachman had already approached her, asking where to take her. Turning around, Rosalind saw the servant and her white horse-drawn carriage about to send her back. As she was about to get into the carriage, Rosalind told the coachman that she needed to go to the Duke of Brighton's mansion first. In the story of the novel, when Rosalind is about to be born, the condition of the Brighton family has deteriorated dramatically. Perhaps for this reason, Rosalind was called the Trouble of Brighton by the mansion and the family. But despite all this, the girl still fought to be loved in the family as a normal child. However, in response, she only heard words from adults about how sinister and bad for the family she was. That is why Rosalind renounced love, but she still needed to marry some aristocrat. And in the world there was such a duke which she could not refuse becoming his wife. This aristocrat was Artisian Filesden, whose surname she took and in whose house she began to live. Rosalind continued to ride in the carriage to his home mansion, reflecting on the fact that they were divorced after all. Looking out the carriage window, the new Rosalind realizes that there will be a lot of noise surrounding her divorce from the Duke. But she will not allow herself to die because of the fact that in the original, she tried to poison the main character of the novel. The girl peered out the window at the castle, thinking that she would make every possible effort for the sake of one goal. Approaching the Duke of Brighton's mansion, the girl vows that she will definitely divorce, no matter what it costs her. Meanwhile, at the mansion, the butler is already informing the Duke of Brighton that the restoration of the antiques has been completed. The butler with the monocle was listing the crystal wares and the carpets with the Brighton seal under restoration. The Duke of Brighton listened intently the entire time until the butler was interrupted by another servant. The door was opened by a red-haired servant who bowed and told the Duke that he had a visitor. At this moment, the Duke of Brighton was minding his own business, but he still asked the maid who she was talking about. The maid immediately said the name of Mrs. Filesden, and then the Duke's mood worsened in an instant. The Duke of Brighton was incredibly angry just from the realization that his evil daughter had arrived at his place. Lowering his gaze down, the Duke angrily ordered the maid to send her back just to avoid seeing her. The maid couldn't help but notice the way the Duke of Brighton was getting sick just at the name of his daughter. The frightened maid replied to the aristocrat that Rosalind had told her that she simply had to see the Duke of Brighton. Upon hearing this, the Duke took off his glasses, saying that she was very insolent for his aristocratic family. Standing up from his desk, the Duke said she had no choice but to wait for him. Looking out the window to reassure himself, the Duke of Brighton told the maid to tell her to wait for him. Before doing so, the Duke also ordered the servants to remove all the chairs and not to give her any water. Gradually, the day drew nearer to evening. The sunset was already decorating the interior with its red light, but the Duke still did not want to go to his daughter. He tiredly took off his glasses after work, sighing and rejoicing that he had already done everything for today. Saying to himself that he had enough work for today, the Duke of Brighton tiredly touched his nose, already going to rest. But suddenly, a worried butler appeared in front of him, and Duke Brighton seriously asked him what was wrong. Coming closer to the nobleman, the butler whispered something important to him that could make him angry quickly. Hearing from the servant that Rosalina was still here, the Duke furiously asked the butler why she hadn't left yet. Meanwhile, Rosalina was still wandering around in the waiting room, realizing that she wasn't going to have it so easy. Sitting down to think about the situation, the heroine realized that her father is really unhappy with her arrival. The girl realizes that with this he is punishing her, his daughter, but Rosalind still wants to show her father confidence. The fact is that the heroine of the story knows how bankrupt her family is, and she will be able to help her family. The girl considers the interior and thinks about the fact that she is obliged to do this just because she is a reborn. At this point, she noticed the way a man whose shoes were very rich came out to her with a family brooch. The heroine of the manhwa turned her attention to her father as he told her that he was quite surprised by her strange behavior. After looking at his daughter with an evil look, the Duke of Brighton asked his daughter, that is, the Duchess of Filesden, why she had come here. In order not to seem like the same evil lady that Rosalind was before her rebirth, the heroine smiled. A determined Rosalina told her father with a smile that she came to him with one request. At this moment, the protagonist remembered that in the novel, women do not have any right to make decisions. Therefore, if she wanted a divorce, she would need the consent of not only her husband, but also her own father. The heroine looked at the Duke and thought to herself that she needed to be more decisive because 5 million was at stake. Clutching her dress with her hands, Rosalina already prepared to tell her father the truth, thinking that she will definitely achieve everything. Coming closer to her father, the protagonist angrily and clearly said that she wanted to divorce her husband. But the girl's words only made the Duke of Brighton even more angry. He told the heroine that she was out of her mind. Deciding to remind the heroine of the past, he said that she used to be constantly raring to get married, telling everyone that she would leave. The Duke even told her that she said she hated this place and all the people who lived here. Also, the heroine's father told her that same night she stole the family seal to get married no matter what. The owner of the mansion turned away, saying that he wasn't surprised by anything anymore. To this, the heroine said that she had changed a lot. The girl's father continued to look at the books while Rosalind asked him to make some kind of deal with her. Hearing this, the Duke still turned around and asked his daughter what she meant by saying this. Placing her hand on his chest, Rosalina once again firmly and decisively said that she wanted to make a deal with him. The father listened attentively to his daughter as she talked about how if he allowed her to get a divorce, she would revive the honor of the family. The girl kept on talking until the father didn't even realize that it wasn't just empty words. Swearing to her father by the Brighton family, the heroine promised that in a year she would fix the family's affairs and prove her right. Promising this to her father, Rosalind continued to look at her father, not even letting him think that she was lying. Thinking that his daughter had not changed at all with her stubbornness, the Duke turned to the butler. To the servant's own surprise, the aristocrat, who hates his daughter with all his soul, ordered him to prepare a room for her. The Duke was already going away while the butler wanted to say something to him, but did not dare. Rosalind was equally surprised. The aristocrat slammed the door behind him, telling the butler that he would not repeat the words twice and he must comply. The butler had nothing else to do but bow to Rosaline and tell her to follow him. After that, the heroine of the story was already walking down the corridor, silently rejoicing for the fact that she had finally returned to Brighton. When she got to her room, the heroine of the manhwa fell on the soft bed. For all this time, she had been standing, and her legs were hurting badly. Tumbling around the bed, the girl rejoiced for finally feeling much better than usual. The girl recalled that in her past life she had dropped out of university and was chalking up a lot of debt. She tried to live a normal life paying off the Borg, but here was her chance to live a rich life. The girl in Rosalina's body couldn't stop thinking about it, realizing that this was a great chance for her to be happy. Remembering the fact that in the novel she must die of execution, the heroine realizes that she must not miss this chance. Already about to sink into sleep, Rosalind thinks for the last time that she is obliged to cope with it. The girl realizes perfectly well that she just needs to not do what the real Rosalina in the novel would do. Resolutely raising her fist in the air, the manhwa heroine motivationally cries out that it's age easier than her part-time job. Continuing to tumble around on the bed with happiness, the girl told herself that she could handle it. While Rosalind was in the bedroom, the Duke was drinking tea in the hall in the company of his butler. The servant poured tea for the aristocrat, asking him why he chose to believe his daughter, since she hadn't even changed. The pensive Duke of Brighton remained silent, gazing intently into his tea. The Duke stared at his own reflection in the tea, not understanding why his daughter had drastically changed in behavior. Breathing in the aroma of the tea and looking somewhere in the distance, the aristocrat is also aware that she has never sat silently in the drawing room before. The heroine's father recalls that when Rosalind was forced to wait, she became incredibly angry. Because of discontent, she dropped everything that fell into her hands, whether it was vases and dishes. The girl would crumble and smash everything she saw with rage, even expensive serving pieces. Continuing to stare at the tea, the Duke of Brighton realizes that a big scandal would be waiting for them right now, but that all is not there. This situation made the Duke of Brighton fold his arms and think hard about it, what Rosalind was thinking about. In the end, the heroine's father just lifted his head up, looking at the ceiling and realizing that he had given his daughter one last chance. The next morning, the protagonist woke up from sleep, rising from the bed and yawning tiredly. The girl scratched her hair until she heard the voice of a maid in the room asking her if she was awake. In front of Rosalind stood a frightened maid who was shaking and asking the heroine whether to prepare a bath for her. After a while, the maid did indeed prepare a bath with pink rose petals for the lady. The girl with tangled pink hair undressed, already preparing to enjoy a hot bath in the morning. Taking off her outer garment, Rosalina held it out to the maid to take it in her hands. However, at that moment, the maid felt herself inadvertently touching her mistress's fingers, which was considered unforgivable. As soon as the maid realized this, her body was immediately wrapped in fear, for she thought that the evil Rosalina would kill her for this. Rosalind watched in amazement as the maid fell to her knees before her, begging for mercy and pardon. She kept saying she would never touch mistress's body if she spared her, which embarrassed Rosaline. The maid was even shaking with fear, saying that she recognized that she had committed the unpardonable sin. The shadow of the heroine loomed over the weeping maid until she herself could no longer come up with excuses for the lady to let her go. But when the protagonist of the manhwa still didn't say anything, the girl decided to look at her, not understanding anything. The girl saw Rosalina in front of her, who was in the bathtub, and replied with a smile that there was nothing wrong with it. After that, the heroine even told the girl that she could go. The kindness from the ever-evil lady surprised the maid. She had nothing left but to bow and obey, saying that she would go out the door in awakens. The girl strode to the door while the sweat of excitement dripped from her forehead, and she herself concealed the fact that she was greatly agitated. The maid closed the doors behind her, letting her emotions come out. She didn't realize it had just happened. Her friend's strange behavior was noticed by another employee, who asked the maid what was wrong with her. While Rosalind was enjoying the hot water, the maid confessed to her friend that the lady had just pardoned her. But to this, the friend only told the girl that she had imagined it all and needed to rest immediately. Meanwhile, Rosalind continued to be in the bathtub while drops of hot water fell from her body. All the while, Rosalina was looking at her face, not understanding why the servants were so frightened of her. But when Rosaline frowned her eyebrows slightly, she immediately realized why the servants were so afraid of her. The heroine admits something that even sent shivers through her body, and she finds it hard to imagine what the servants feel when she is angry. Realizing that it is necessary to smile, Rosalina went out to the servants in a robe, trying not to frighten them. But as soon as the girls saw the angry lady, they were scared half to death, opening their mouths in surprise. One of the maids even had a magazine fall out of her hands, after which it fell loudly on the stone floor. Coming closer, Rosalina decided to take the magazine in her hands and read what the maids were interested in. The magazine is titled Gossip Girl, and the biggest news in it is that the hero of the empire is finally getting a divorce. The heroine of the manhwa decided to open the magazine while reading the most important news that the hero of the empire, Filesden, is getting a divorce. From the magazine, the girl learned that the sole heir of the Filesden family, which is considered the most powerful empire, is getting a divorce. Artisian always ended battles with his victory, but marriage with Rosalina was more like war than love. All this was written in a magazine that Rosalina read, wondering who would take her place. After that, the girl could only wait grudgingly for the maid to wipe her hair with a towel. What she read from the magazine kept Rosalind from thinking about anything else, but at the same time she was not upset about it. Suddenly, another maid entered the room to the heroine, who was very afraid of her. It turns out that she brought the lady a letter. The protagonist raised her hand and, looking at the maid, asked her to give her this very letter. The girl looked at the back of the letter, hoping to find out who it was from because she was very curious. It turns out that the blue letter was written for Rosalind from the Duke of Filston, her ex-husband. The protagonist decided to open the letter at once, thinking about what her ex-husband wanted to tell her. Rosalina noticed that from the letter immediately fell a check, which she quickly picked up. Taking it in her hands, the girl read that it was a check for as much as 1,000,000 coins, which incredibly surprised her. Also shocked, the girl read the sheet to what it said was a down payment of 20%. At the end of the letter, Artisian also wrote that he hoped that Rosalina would not change her mind about her decision. Such good news only made the heroine happy, causing her to smile widely. After all, in fact, the pink-haired happy girl is only happy that she divorced her husband. Happy for the fact that she had more motivation, the heroine asked the maid to bring her any unremarkable cape. After a while, the protagonist was already in a completely different place, where she was going to spend her millions. It turns out the girl was at the auction, which has already taken out the main product of the day. The precious commodity of the auction is the tears of the wind, which are very much needed by the protagonist. Rosalina sat at the table and did not take her eyes off the jewelry because she really wants to get the important tears of wind. The girl needs them very much for the reason that with their help, it will be possible to remove the curse of Leodore. But looking at the letter that her ex-husband sent her earlier, the heroine rejoiced for the fact that she has a thick purse. The protagonist is already imagining how easily she will get the tears of the wind, and with the remaining money she will buy herself a lot of sweets. But after a few minutes of bargaining, the Manhwa heroine realized that she had jumped to conclusions too much. She raised her number and said the cost, but the mysterious man next to her kept offering an amount more. Looking at him, Rosalina realizes that the man beside her could easily win the auction and take the tears of the wind. The mysterious masked man always offers a larger sum, while remaining silent and seems to be looking at the heroine as well. The girl recalls that she had a check in her hand for about 1,000,000 gold coins. But just because of this stranger, she lost almost the entire amount at a time, which she had not thought through. The stranger kept offering an amount more than the protagonist, and that was what was starting to alarm her. Clutching her license plate in the palm of her hand, Rosalina realizes that she has to make this deal right now. Standing up from her seat, the Manhwa's protagonist showed the host her number and shouted that she would give 1,000,000 coins for the tears of the wind. After a while, the coveted tears of wind did end up in the hands of the rather protagonist. The happy and joyful girl could not even admire what she gave 1,000,000 gold coins for. The heroine of the Manhwa would have already sat down in the carriage, but at that moment a stranger was already approaching her. The same stranger who was sitting beside the heroine shouted to Rosalina that he wanted to offer her a deal. The offer interested Rosalina, so she turned around asking the stranger what he was talking about. Trying to change the heroine's mind, the stranger told the girl that it wasn't just a pretty thing and she wouldn't need it. The stranger came closer to the girl and told her that he would offer 5,000,000 for the tears of the wind if she agreed. To this, the heroine said immediately that she didn't need it, while simultaneously wondering what he was telling her. The Manhwa heroine's sudden refusal surprised the masked stranger, but he wasn't about to back down. The indignant girl suspiciously asked him why he didn't immediately give 5,000,000 for the tears if he had them. The mysterious man was bewildered, not even knowing what to say to the bright and intelligent girl. Looking at the stranger with a smile, the heroine said that she knew perfectly well the purpose of this thing. Clutching the precious tears of wind in her hands, the girl said that she wanted to help her sick brother with them. At the same second, the heroine of the story let herself grab the stranger by the collar, threatening him. Piercing the man with her red eyes, the girl told him to give up nicely before it was too late. Suddenly, the masked stranger felt something strange from the girl's insolence. It was as if he was being attacked by a madness he couldn't control. He regrets that his power has awakened just now. It seems that the stranger even imagines that, and the heroine was very afraid of his anger and aggression. In his imagination, he saw the fear in the girl's eyes as he himself reached out his hand to do something to her. The man imagined doing something to hurt her, causing her to quickly turn away from him and scream. The mysterious stranger didn't know how to match the force, but what the heroine said surprised him the most. However, back in reality, Rosalina continued to look at the stranger and asked him if he understood her words. Realizing that he would not be able to procure the tears of the wind, the stranger closed his eyes, resigned to defeat. Adjusting his hood, the stranger said that he understood the girl's words, and he apologized to her for his behavior. Looking away, the man also informed the protagonist that a carriage was surely waiting for her. It seems that the man's emotions show that he is not ready to accept defeat, but there is nothing else for him to do. Suddenly, the boy noticed that Rosalind held out her handkerchief to him, which surprised him even more. The girl continued to hold out her handkerchief to him, causing him to ask her what it was and why. The girl looked pityingly at her interlocutor, telling him to wipe his sweat because, in her opinion, he was very bad. However, the stranger pushed the handkerchief away from him, telling the Manhwa heroine that he was fine. He was about to leave, but Rosalina kept up with him, asking how she could understand it. The girl asked the stranger to accept the gift for giving in to her, but the man replied that he wouldn't accept it anyway. Suddenly, the man felt what the girl had deliberately touched his cheek with her handkerchief. Rosalina continued to wipe the sweat on the stranger's face with a smile while the man was in genuine surprise. Wiping the man's face, the heroine slyly said that right now he was already using it. The girl also said that now he had no right to refuse her handkerchief. The heroine's words surprised the stranger even more. At this moment, the guy felt a strange feeling similar to pain, and assuming that it was because of madness. But Rosalind was already saying goodbye to him, saying that in the future he would give her the handkerchief if they met again. The protagonist of the story was walking away to her carriage before the man even had time to realize anything. That's how the heroine of the Manhwa left the mysterious stranger, surprising him with just about everything she could. After the girl no longer looked at him, the mysterious man decided to remove the mask from his face. It turns out that the stranger was Rosalind's ex-husband, Duke Fielstan, who marveled at how his ex-wife had changed. The day was nearing evening, and a beautiful red-haired sunset was already looming in the sky. The Duke of Brighton was doing his work as usual, listening to a servant's report on the extinguishing of the fire on the grounds. But suddenly the servant burst into the study again, to whom the Duke asked what was wrong. The Duke of Brighton tapped his pen on the desk as he listened to the servant's words about Rosaline making a fuss in front of the young master's room. Also, when the servant admitted that Miss Eliza was not doing well on her own, the Duke could not stand it and broke the pen in anger. Touching his hand to his forehead, the aristocrat tried to calm down somehow before going to deal with it. But he couldn't, and because of his rage towards his daughter, he shouted her name with all his might. Immediately after that, the Duke did not hesitate. He went to Rosalind to teach her a lesson. Duke Brighton angrily paced the hallway, realizing that he had been very foolish. Remembering Rosalind's face, the Duke realizes that he was foolish for the reason that he forgave her even after betraying her. The aristocrat immediately burst into the room, shouting Rosalind's name again and asking her where she is. The fact was that long ago, the Duke of Brighton had lost two treasures of his life at once. The first such treasure was the mother of the heroine of the Manhwa, Beatrice, who died tragically. And also the Duke as a father lost a very rare patron of the Brighton family, his son. It all started with little Rosaline breaking a branch of the magical fairy tree one day. And wanting revenge, the fairy decided to put a curse on them, as she was incredibly angry with everyone. Immediately after the terrible curse, Leodore, son of the Duke of Brighton, fell into an eternal sound sleep. The angry witch also wanted to curse little Rosaline, but Beatrice was already rushing to her aid. Embracing her daughter, the mother managed to save Rosalina from the terrible curse, but it cost her life. The family quickly split when the curse caused Beatrice to go into premature labor. Beatrice ended up dying because of the curse for Rosaline without ever giving birth to her child. After that, the Duke of Brighton was left with only the protagonist, who was shocked by her mother's death. All this time, Rosaline was called the cursed child in the family, which is not surprising because she became a trouble for everyone. And the only person who saw it all with her own eyes is Eliza, who worked as Beatrice's maid. Back in the present, that same Eliza angrily asked to give the heroine of the story what she had in her hand. Piercing Rosalind with a glare, Eliza told her that she could not allow her to feed the sleeping Leodore something suspicious. Rosalina insisted, however, saying that there was nothing suspicious about it and she would prove it. But Eliza kept saying that in that case she had no choice and would order Dorothy to capture her. Hearing the order from the lady, the maid with that name apologized to Rosalina before detaining her. However, it was at that moment that the Duke of Brighton burst into the room and shouted his daughter's name. The father glared menacingly at his daughter, realizing the fact that she once again wanted to pull something on her sleeping brother. As soon as the Duke appeared, he was pounced upon by a crying Eliza, who tried to explain the whole situation. Looking sadly at the nobleman, Eliza told the Duke that Rosalina wanted to feed Leodore something suspicious. The heroine's brother, who had never yet awakened from the curse, was indeed lying in the room sleeping an eternal sleep. The Duke of Brighton came closer to Rosalind, already about to threaten her with his words. The father looked angrily at his daughter, whom he hates, asking her what she was up to this time. But the protagonist of the Manhwa continued to remain silent, even when her father ordered her to answer him. Instead of unnecessary words, she decided to open the flask of wind tears that she's going to help her brother with. To make sure that it was not poison, the heroine first drank some of the tears herself, right in front of everyone. After that, the girl lifted the wind tears upwards, telling everyone that it was them and not poison. Looking at her sleeping brother, who was lying next to her, Rosalina said that with their help she would be able to help him. Eliza, however, shouted at the girl, asking her on what grounds they should all believe her. The heroine replied with a smile that she learned about the tears of the wind in her ex-husband's office, so they should at least trust him. In fact, the heroine had learned it from the very novel she had read before her rebirth, not in Filesden's office itself. The girl glanced at the potion as she continued to tell her family that she had learned many things in her 2 years of marriage. The Duke of Brighton listened attentively to his daughter's words and seemed to gradually begin to believe her. But Eliza continued to be angry, asking the heroine how she was able to get to the place where only the head of the family is allowed to enter. With a wave of his hand, the Duke quickly silenced the maid, trying to tell his daughter his opinion. As the Duke of Brighton sighed tiredly, Eliza didn't even believe that he would listen to Rosalind. Moving closer, the Duke recognized that it was all entirely possible, as Rosalind always gets what she wants. Reaching out his hand to his sleeping brother, the Duke of Brighton let the heroine know that the chance to save her brother was open to her. The heroine of the story immediately moved closer to Leodore, sitting down on his lap and examining him. Looking at his face and long white hair, the girl thinks that she just has to save him and win her father's trust. The heroine began to open a flask of wind tears, hoping that they will help her brother. After that, the girl carefully poured a potion on her brother's tongue, forcing him to swallow the tears of wind. Rosalina began to wait, expecting a miracle and her brother's imminent awakening from his eternal sleep. When the heroine called his name, sincerely hoping that he would open his eyes, she looked at his eyelashes. And at the same moment, Leodore's eyes did indeed flutter open from the magic potion. The Lord's awakening surprised everyone, causing Eliza and the Duke of Brighton to look at him excitedly. However, the first person Leodore saw was Rosalind, whom he called by name and to whom he extended his hand. The protagonist already wanted to hold her brother's weak hand, asking him what he wanted to say to her. Before he said anything, Leodore only touched his sister's hand slightly, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. Leodore said tiredly and sleepily that he thought Rosalind had grown up to be a lady. And immediately after these words, the heroine's brother closed his eyes again, falling into a long sleep. When Leodore went to sleep, the heroine of the story even noticed an unusual pink lightning that appeared above him. The upset girl realized that this is the curse of the fairy, which is still working on him. Gathering to say something to her brother, Rosalina began her monologue by saying that she did not know if he could hear her now. As she continued speaking, the heroine took her brother's hand and promised him that she would help him wake up as soon as possible. The girl even said that she sincerely promised this, which was evident in her honest eyes. The Duke of Brighton could not help but notice the kindness and sincerity of his wicked daughter, which amazed him very much. However, Eliza, who had been watching all this time on the contrary, was not happy about Rosalind's appearance in the house. Looking up angrily with rage, she uttered the heroine's name as if Eliza were about to take revenge on her. After his brother's brief awakening, the Duke of Brighton decided to ask his daughter what she wanted from him. The protagonist's father mentioned both dresses and jewelry, telling Rosalind that he would give her anything. The heroine was surprised that her father went along with her, but at the same time she does not understand why he is so unhappy. The girl wanted to tell her father her wish, but he interrupted her, saying that he would fulfill what she wanted so much as a child. It turns out that all this time the Duke was talking about a summer house, which surprised the protagonist. But Rosalind disagreed with her father, looking at her tea and about to say something to him. Looking at her father, the heroine admitted to him that she didn't need any reward because she was just saving her brother. After that, the girl simply stood up and told her father that she would go, but with that she only surprised the Duke more. However, as the Duke of Brighton thought, when the girl was about to leave, she said that she remembered something. Because of this, the aristocrat was a little wary, listening to his daughter carefully and looking at her. Turning around and looking at the Duke of Brighton, the heroine said that she knew perfectly well that he was very busy with work. And, to the surprise of the gentleman himself, Rosalind only asked to spend more time with her brother, that is, Leodore. After this conversation, the Duke of Brighton strolled through the corridors, remembering his daughter's last words. Looking closely at the large portrait of Rosalind as a child, the father could not believe that his daughter had changed. At that moment, the Duke heard what some regular servant girl was begging the heroine for mercy for her transgression. Coming closer, the aristocrat realized that the maid accidentally spilled a bucket of water on the dress of the heroine, for which she begged for forgiveness. But to the surprise of everyone, Rosalind simply told the maid that it was all right, although she had not forgiven it before. The Duke had been watching his changed daughter closely all this time, not fully understanding the situation. Remembering how she promised her brother to help, the aristocrat even thinks about the fact that she wised up in the Fileston family. Also from the Duke's head did not get out of Rosalind's words about the fact that she spent 3 years alone. All this made the Duke of Brighton think about the heroine of the Manhwa more and more often, even when he was sitting at work. Some of his thoughts about Rosalind he even spoke aloud, which surprised his subordinates, who stood nearby and did not understand anything. After a while, to Eliza already reached the news that the Duke approved the divorce. This made her very angry. Biting her finger from stress, Eliza realizes that it seems that her father took pity on her when he saw her attitude towards her brother. Eliza, like a queen, continued to sit in her chair, thinking out a plan on what she should do next. Thinking of herself as an aristocrat, Eliza even put her feet on the maid's back, as if she was just a piece of furniture. Relaxing her legs against the maid's back, the evil Eliza began to think that Rosalina should be chased away. But suddenly the villainess turned to her subordinate, asking her if she had cleaned everything. Immediately after, the mistress pushed the maid with all her might with her feet, causing her to roll backwards. After getting up from her seat, she was already picking up the whip, saying that it seems her maid was not fully trained in everything yet. Looking at the frightened girl with her scary eyes, Eliza affectionately told her not to worry about it. While real fear was read in the maid's eyes, the overbearing Eliza told her that she would correct her behavior right now. But before she started hitting the maid, Eliza told her that she should thank her after each blow. After that, the evil lady took another look at the unfortunate maid and asked her if she understood everything. Looking the terrible woman in the eyes, the maid wanted to say something to her, but could not because of the intense pain. Meanwhile, the Duke invited the heroine to his office and had already told her that he approved of the divorce, which surprised Rosalind. Taking off his glasses, the Duke once again told the lady that he really approves of her divorce from Duke Fileston. The protagonist is even more pleased that, according to her father, her former surname and rights in the House of Brighton revert to her. Also, raising his eyes to his daughter, the Duke told her that it would be nice if she called him father again. Rosalind was ready to fly to the seventh heaven with happiness as the Duke wondered to the heroine why she was smiling like that. Joyfully throwing her hands up in the air, the girl happily proclaimed that she had finally made it. The girl rejoiced at the news like a little child because just now she came one step closer to the cherished divorce. However, suddenly the heroine thought about money, remembering that she would need more coins to save the remaining 4 million. The fact is that in the world of the novel into which the heroine was reborn, divorce is considered a disgrace for a woman. Therefore, there is a tradition thanks to which the girl returns back to her birth family, trying to make a new marriage. In the first marriage, the girl's property brought from her birth family remains with her. But in the remarriage, there is nothing of the kind, because in essence, the girl has to thank for the fact that she was taken in marriage. The determined heroine realized that for this reason she wants to buy back the title and become independent, and for this she needs money. Going to fulfill her plans, the girl kept thinking that she needed even more coins for a comfortable life. But suddenly a text appeared right in front of the girl as if she was caught in some kind of game. She lifted her head up. The voice was telling her that she had changed her destiny more than 3 times, and she was now a summoner of items from an unknown world. While the mysterious voice was telling to unlock new abilities using fate energy, the girl was greatly surprised by it. Thanks to this, the lady shouted that it looked like she was in a game of the romantic fiction genre that only she had heard of. Clutching the blanket with the palm of her hand, the girl rejoiced that her rating in the game was F, and she could already see a road strewn with rose petals in front of her. It seems that from the good mood of the heroine, even the flowers around could bloom, because she's very happy for her life. After a while, the protagonist decided to go to a place that resembles an abandoned mine. In this mine turned out to be beautiful lakes, which had a rich blue color. Rosalind also brought the main character of the novel, Daisy, with her to the mine, telling her that it was very beautiful. The heroine of the story paced behind Daisy, telling her that this mine was given to her as a gift for her 14th birthday. Looking angrily at her rival, Rosaline also said that it was just abandoned now. After her words, the heroine held out the mine document to Daisy, saying that she was giving it to her so that they could be friends. Daisy, being in the large mine, was surprised, for it was indeed the mine deed. Looking at Rosalind, Daisy asked her how she could accept such an expensive gift from her. However, the heroine villain of the novel only whispered menacingly to Daisy to accept the gift as long as she was kind. Gesturing with her hand, the proud Rosaline said that this place had real value. She then pointed her finger in the direction and told Daisy to look over there. The girls admired the crystal-clear water while Rosalina told her friend that this lake was endowed with the power of fairies. Hearing this, Daisy bent closer to the water, looking at it and saying that it was very beautiful. But behind the novel's protagonist, the cunning Rosaline was already sneaking up behind her, plotting something. After shouting to Daisy that she was very happy for her, Rosalina pushed her hard into the water, intending to take her life. A shocked Daisy screamed and fell into the water, not even expecting such a treacherous act from her new friend. Moments later, the novel's protagonist plunged underwater, where even Rosalind could not see her. Coming closer to the water, the villainess looked for her drowned friend among the many air bubbles in the water. Rosalind continued to stare at the bottom and made sure that Daisy had indeed died from the cold water. Only bubbles remained on the surface of the clear water, which occasionally popped for air. Adorning her face with a sly smile, Rosalina realized that she had succeeded and gotten rid of Daisy. The villainess continued to stare into the water, telling Daisy that even if she tried to get out, she still wouldn't escape from the mine. Remembering how Daisy's body sank to the bottom in the novel, the heroine realizes that this plan of the villain is very well thought out. However, pondering all this in her head, the girl remembered that Daisy safely sank to the bottom without getting a scratch. In addition, Rosalind remembered that it was there, according to the plot of the novel, that Daisy found many precious stones. After that, in the regular story, she was rescued by the hero Calix, and they cuddled happily, revealing themselves to each other. But also apart from what was said in this episode, the hero noticed what evil deeds Rosalina was doing. Taking a deep breath of air into her lungs, Rosalina realizes that she is well aware of the plot of the novel in which she was reborn. She was already rolling up her sleeves, thinking that she would only do good and good deeds on the contrary. Presenting the scales with an offer to go into the lake, receiving 10 billion, or refuse, the heroine realizes she must do it. Taking off her boots and tying her tail, Rosalina is about to prepare to jump into the lake, at the bottom of which she wants to get the jewels. Before doing so, she sighed resolutely, about to change the story in the novel for the umpteenth time. When she had enough motivation, her heel pushed off the surface and she ran towards the crystalline water. Screaming with courage, the girl was already falling off the cliff into the water when the Brighton family brooch was already hanging around her neck. The girl watched as she got closer and closer to the water, not allowing herself to even think about anything going wrong. The girl did take the plunge into the water, where she would later retrieve the cherished gems for riches. After the protagonist of the story swam in the lake, she came to the building of the Shadowy Information Guild of Hennes. Meanwhile, in one of the offices of the building, one man's terrifying and agonizing screams were heard. Grasping his heart, he felt an incredible pain that didn't stop for a moment. This man turned out to be Duke Filesden, who was even sweating from the pain trying to endure it. This was all being watched by his subordinate, who realized that this was the Filesden family's insanity that was being passed down. After calming down a bit, Duke Artisian asked the boy what the results of some research were. The boy briefly read to the Lord that according to the research of wizards and shamans, it was an ordinary handkerchief. Hearing that the thing the heroine lent to the Duke earlier was ordinary, Artisian got even more angry, clenching his palm into a fist. This caused the Duke to look at the boy as angrily as possible, telling him to go. The boy immediately listened to the Lord and ran away, saying that he was about to leave the room. After the extra people left the room, the Duke was able to breathe a sigh of relief from the recent, intense madness. Artisian decided to open the nightstand of his desk, which held the very handkerchief that the heroine of the story had recently given him. Taking it in his hands and looking at it closely, Artisian doesn't understand what that woman did to that handkerchief that he is so drawn to it. To make up for the feelings he once felt, Duke Artisian leans the handkerchief against his forehead, and it makes him feel better. The Duke thinks about the fact that even the continent's best physician, the strongest mage and the wizard of the magic tower couldn't stop his suffering. Artisian also recalls that when he is attacked by madness, it is as if his heart freezes and then warms up again. The aristocrat had always felt pain in his body, but when he had this shawl, he felt dramatically better. The angry Artisian clutched the handkerchief even tighter in his hands, as if asking Rosalina what she had done to him. Thinking back to his ex-wife, Artisian realizes that she is a leech woman who used him to gain power over people. Rosalina used to tear after the opportunity to be with him, but now she easily walks away, waving at him like she did in their last encounter. Recalling her appearance and voice, Artisian wonders to himself if he knows her well or not. It all keeps Artisian's mind off of her. He bows his head down, continuing to think about his ex-wife. The Duke's tranquility was interrupted by a servant who immediately alerted him that Miss Falsden had come to see him. Artisian was stunned. It only took the Duke a couple of minutes to throw on his clothes, which was audible in the empty hallway. Artisian entered the living room to his guest, wearing a mask and robe, apologizing for keeping the heroine waiting. On the couch sat the heroine of the story, who was all drenched to the skin. He was clutching her hair to rid it of the water. The completely soaked girl laughed with slight embarrassment while Artisian himself marveled at her presence and appearance. The girl smilingly directed her head towards the stranger, telling him that she had come to retrieve her handkerchief that she had given away earlier. At first, the masked and caped Artisian decided to sit at the table, asking the heroine why she had come here. Shaking off the water droplets from herself, the girl cryptically replied that all she wanted to do was build a good foundation. Also fixing strands of her wet hair, the heroine clarified that she wanted to build a good foundation for her future. However, getting up from her seat, Rosalina said a little slyly that she left the rest in secret, which reminded the Duke of his former wife. The heroine's words interested and alerted the masked Artisian, but he did not pester the girl with questions. Instead, the Duke recalled an incident when he was on a camping trip 2 years ago on the border of the Empire. He spent his time in a tent while outside its entrance was guarded by a soldier in iron armor. However, the nobleman was already finishing doing his work in the tent, holding up the cloth and getting ready to go outside. The Duke was adjusting his mittens, asking his colleague if they had finished their report, but at that moment someone called out to him loudly. A servant held out a letter to the nobleman, saying it was an urgent message from the mansion. Artisian immediately opened it and read in it that the Duchess was dying, and he needed to return to the mansion urgently. But this news only made him even angrier at his own wife. Remembering the perfidy and malice of his Duchess, Artisian does not even believe that she is actually dying. Regretting nothing, Duke Artisian decides to burn the letter with the flames of a bonfire, thinking that Rosalind is unbearable. Meanwhile, it was already dark in the Falsden family mansion. Evening was gradually changing to night. Duke Artisian jumped off his horse to get closer to his castle and leave the animal alone. Before leaving, the nobleman stroked the horse's neck as if to thank it for coming a long way. After that, the Duke decided to take off his hood and see the truth with his own eyes, making a surprise visit for his wife. Meanwhile, the mansion was indeed noisy because maids and servants were running in different directions. Hiding behind a column, the Duke carefully watched what exactly the servants were trying to prepare. All of this was commanded by Rosalind, who was angry at everyone saying to hang black curtains in the mansion to make everything believable. However, the 3 servants decided to tell the Duchess directly that they would not be able to find exactly black curtains in such a short time. Hearing the servants' defiance, Rosalind looked at them and asked them whether it meant that they were helpless. Because of the Duchess's strictness, the servants immediately scattered, trying to find the black curtains and remove the blue ones, which the lady did not like. Rosalind continued to walk around the garden as Duke Artisian watched her and realized that she was alive and well. Keeping his eyes on the Duchess, the aristocrat also realizes that this was most likely a trap for him. But when the Duke turned back, he heard her sly voice saying that she was glad to see him. This girl turned out to be the evil Rosaline, who easily spotted her husband in the garden. Rosalina called the Duke by name while he himself was excited for it. Seems she could sense his presence. At first, the nobleman didn't think to show himself from behind the pillar, but then he decided not to hide. Duke Artisian stepped out to Rosalind, asking her what she had made the whole spectacle for. The girl was not going to answer the nobleman immediately, only touching a beautiful flower in the garden. Holding out the white flower to the Duke, Rosalina admitted that it was all to get him to come here. Moving closer to her husband, the villainess confessed that the news of her condition would make him return to her for a moment, and it did. She then placed a flower on Artisian's chest, saying she was glad that her plan had worked. When the Duke was still reluctant to take the flower from his wife's hand, Rosalind asked him if he would continue to stand like that. Unable to withstand the ignoring, the girl threw the flower on the ground, showing Artisian her indifference. Giving her husband her sly smile, the girl said that she immediately realized that there was something connecting them when she first saw him. In addition, Rosalina pierced the Duke with her gaze, which was full of power and indifference. Moving even closer to the Duke, the girl said that now she had to go to the battlefield, and he should just stay with her. But with a sharp wave of his hand, Artisian made Rosalind stop carrying on a bit, shouting that he was fed up with everything. Sensing the poisonous aura from Rosalina, the aristocrat realized that the woman in front of him was an obnoxious, selfish woman. Looking at her with red eyes, the Duke even had the thought of killing her in his mind. He was already reaching out to her, thinking that his strength would be enough to make her fragile neck break. But unexpectedly for an aristocrat, Rosalind took his cheeks, asking if his insomnia had gotten worse. Covering his eyes with her hand, the girl told him to go to sleep, for insomnia is dangerous. The girl's magic worked on the Duke, and he closed his eyes, thinking that he would feel better. Then quickly came the next day, when there was already a clear sky over the castle. Suddenly Artisian woke up as if from a nightmare, rising from his bed in terror. He noticed at once that Rosalind was sleeping beside him, and at the same time he did not realize what she had done to him yesterday. The Duke looked at her and thought that she was a dangerous woman, and he did not fully know what she was capable of. Artisian decided to reach out to her again, thinking that if he killed her, he could end it all. As his hand reached out to hurt her, the Duke himself took notice of how sweetly she was sleeping. In the end, the aristocrat was unable to raise his hand against the lady, clenching it into a fist in anger. Deciding to leave, the Duke threw his cape over himself and was already in a hurry to leave the castle with the Duchess. His long and dark cloak slid on the floor behind the Duke while the same Duke was already walking out into the corridor. Without delay, the Duke immediately got on his horse and rode away from the castle, going to do the job. But he did not even suspect that all this time Rosalind was not asleep and watched him closely from the balcony. She only had to look sadly at how her beloved Duke disappeared from sight, leaving her alone. Returning to the present, the Duke noticed that Rosalind was also reaching out her hand to comfort him, but in character it was as if it were a different girl. She asked the stranger curiously if he was listening to her. It was only at this moment that Artisian came back from his deep thoughts and realized that he had been thinking too hard. He looked at the heroine of the story with wet hair with his mouth ajar, wondering something. Deciding to break the silence, the stranger for Rosalind coughed a little and said that she had told him about the handkerchief. The girl again replied with a smile that she had come here precisely for it. The Duke's words, however, seemed to deaden her with shock when he said that he could not return it now. By this time, there was already a servant outside the door who wanted to serve tea to the aristocrats. But what he heard outside the door made him marvel so much that he almost spilled the tea in the teapot. In the Manhwa world, to get into the shadowy Hennis organization, you have to find an antique store at the end of one alley. And it is very close to a statue of the first emperor of the empire holding a sword. It was in such a place that the protagonist got out of the carriage when she got to this place. Entering the house, the girl took with her a figure of the king from the chess deck, and, placing this piece on the table, she began to draw attention to herself by tapping it on the table. After looking at the servant, the girl seriously said that she intended to meet with the head of the Hennis Guild. Only then was she allowed to enter the living room, where she could already meet with the guild head. Returning to the present, the girl was surprised by the head's words that he would not return her handkerchief. Looking at the way the stranger was sitting, the heroine could not understand why he was talking about it so confidently. Playing along a bit, the girl tried to show the guild head that she was upset by shaking her head to the side. Thinking that it looked like her plan had worked perfectly, the girl played up the anxiety, asking if he had lost it. Tilting her head in sadness, the heroine admitted to the stranger that it was more than just a handkerchief to her. Squeezing out tears for plausible play, Rosalina told the guild leader that it was her only gift from her ex-husband. The girl kept saying it was impertinence, while the masked heroine's ex-husband himself couldn't understand when he gave her a handkerchief. Artisian lowered his head, thinking, after all, it is an ordinary handkerchief without embroidery, but Rosalind clings to it strongly. But at the same time, looking at the heroine of the Manhwa, the Duke in disguise does not understand why he had to give her a handkerchief precious to her. Looking at the lady again, the masked stranger asked the heroine if he could find out when she received the gift. However, the protagonist only folded her arms unhappily and began to indignantly tell the guild leader that she was amazed at his indecent behavior. She, playing up the situation a bit, asked the masked stranger if this wasn't where gathering information was the main job of the Hennis Guild. Glancing at the empty vase in the living room of the house, the heroine continued to resent him, saying not only did he lose her precious handkerchief, but he was also asking stupid questions. Sighing with artificial disappointment, the girl closed her eyes and admitted honestly that she had high hopes for this place. But, according to her words, the head of the guild killed them. All the while, the masked artisan listened attentively to her words of disappointment and realized that she had other goals for him in this place. Rosalina even dared to come closer to the masked stranger and tell him to his face that, in her opinion, he was not worthy of the title of the head of the main guild of the empire. Artisian only said with a smile that he accepted her criticism. The tension between them was like a white and fluffy dog along with a black cat growling at each other, showing their displeasure. But in the end, the masked artisan folded his arms and lowered his head, sighing as if he was going to make a serious decision rather than continue listening to the heroine's discontent. While the handkerchief had been in his nightstand the entire time, Guildhead Hennis himself had replied to Rosalind that he couldn't give the handkerchief away and had no excuse to do so. Standing up from his seat and walking over to the chair, Artisian said that instead, if the heroine was interested, he could compensate everything with the services of the henna organization. Mysterious to the protagonist, the guy pulled back the chair in front of her and offered to sit on it, hinting that he would fulfill any of her requests in the realm of the Information Guild. The heroine realized that this was exactly what she wanted. In fact, this whole plan of Rosalina's was just for the sake of getting the services of the best Information Guild in the Empire for free. All this time, the head had been watching the girl and observing her reaction. The heroine looked at the masked stranger in a way that clearly read joy and delight on her face because she got what she wanted. Of course, she wasn't going to turn down something like that. However, to be serious until the end, she did not choose to show her smile and joy to everyone, but continued to play the indignant lady who is upset about the guild leader losing her handkerchief. The girl sat down at the chair that Artisian had pulled back for her, naively telling him that she couldn't refuse if he wanted it so badly for her. The masked stranger remained silent. For more believability to what was going on, Rosalina decided to play the more indignant and arrogant lady, saying that this time she would give in to him and forgive the transgression. But that only made the masked guild head smile slyly. The protagonist's words made him think that she wasn't as ordinary and evil as he had known her to be all along. After a while, the protagonist did tell the guild head what she wanted. She came here to get a separate title so that she wouldn't be remarried. Glancing at the golden cup of her tea, the masked artisan clarified to the heroine whether she definitely needed the money and title to protect herself from remarriage. And Rosalind was already drinking her tea, talking calmly to her interlocutor. She was answering him that no one would want to marry a second time out of convenience, especially when there was a choice to be free and with money. Looking at the masked stranger who was listening attentively to her, the heroine also said that she wanted to accumulate wealth under another name and then live well for the rest of her life. In fact, looking at the head of the guild, the girl was very happy that he understood her from the first word, and he did not need to chew on everything in detail, which she considered a plus. In fact, the girl recalled that when she first saw that white mask at the auction, she immediately realized who was sitting next to it. It was the head of the guild, Hennis, who turned out to be very necessary to her. The girl recognized it so easily because of the mask on the stranger's face that only he wears. Hennis is a high-ranking organization that can solve any issue. Imagining in her head whole bags of gold and the head of the guild who refuses to give them up, the protagonist remembers that even if they are flooded with money, they can refuse. The girl kept thinking about it and feeling proud of herself because this plan was quite risky, but luckily it didn't fail, for which Rosalina praises herself. But aside from the plan that worked and her joy, the girl can't help but notice the unique appearance of the guild leader she is looking at right now. The girl thought about if she takes a good look at his hair and eyes, she recognizes the fact that his appearance is great, not like all the people she meets. However, also remembering the way he spoke to her during their conversations, the girl can't get away from the feeling that it's like it's all familiar, and they've known each other for a long time too. As the man continued to say something, the girl looked at his lips and chin, not realizing where she had seen him before, that she was getting such strange feelings. Coming to her senses, the heroine of the Manhwa suddenly flinched when the guild leader called out to her for the umpteenth time, not realizing what she had been thinking about so much that she had stopped hearing him. Noticing for a moment the fact that the lady had carelessly picked up a cup of hot tea that was about to fall on her, the masked stranger quickly rose from his seat, going to save her. It took the man a couple of moments to move the lady away from the chair and save her from the shards of the cup and the hot tea. After the cup shattered on the floor, Artisian asked the heroine if she had hurt herself. There was indeed a shattered cup lying on the stone floor near the girl, which could have injured Rosalind's feet, but fortunately it did not happen. But when the girl turned her head towards the guild leader to say something, she didn't even realize that he would be so close to her. She could even make out his red eyes, which showed a slight fear for her. It was at that moment that Artesian Saluga decided to burst into the room, opening the doors with both hands in shock, not realizing what they had happened there and why it had gotten so loud. The boy with the ponytail once again asked his master what had happened, but when she noticed the fact that Rosalind and the master himself stood awkwardly far away from each other, not daring to say anything, he too became uncomfortable. Artesian did not answer Maurice, but only handed him the papers and told him to bring all the documents about getting another name with the list of titles that were being sold. Maurice, a boy himself, didn't even expect such words from the Lord. He looked at him in amazement, once again asking if he really should carry all the papers. After Maurice ran to fulfill his duties, the guild leader Henne decided to turn to the protagonist and ask her what she would now pay for the service with. Artesian also decided to tell the young lady right away that Hennes's services would not be cheap, but repentantly, the girl was not too surprised by this, for she had already prepared everything. She looked at the head of the Henne Guild with a smile and told him just as happily that he didn't have to worry about it. In fact, the girl already had everything for this already. After the protagonist said that she would pay for everything on the spot, she took out a large sack from somewhere and then placed it on the table. And from the sack sprinkled all sorts of blue-colored gems, which before that she got at the bottom of the lake in the mine. After a while, when the lady was already able to successfully negotiate with the head of the guild Hennes for a good cooperation, the girl repeatedly replayed in her head how the masked stranger touched her waist when he saved her from the cup. But, in addition, the main character of the manhwa couldn't forget the way she looked, the head of the guild, looked into her eyes when they were incredibly close to each other. Tilting her head down, the girl thought about the whole situation, which she had in no way expected. She was surprised by both the Lord's reaction and his excitement for her. The protagonist was sitting near the window in the most beautiful robes with stones, looking somewhere in the distance, thinking about why that stranger was wearing a mask on his face. The girl pictured in her mind the mystical guild leader Hennes playing chess, wondering if he was only wearing that mask because he had a scar on his face. Rosalind would have continued to think about whether he was mentioned in the original novel, whether she knew anything about him, and who he was in general, but in an instant she was surprised to find herself thinking about him so much. Glancing at her tea, the girl couldn't understand why she was only thinking about him when she herself had a bunch of things to take care of. The heroine of the novel realized that she needed to pull herself together. Raising her head and looking at something with her rich pink eyes, the heroine firmly told herself that there were other things she needed to pay attention to right now. And Rosalind knows exactly which thing she should be interested in first. After visualizing herself in even bigger and more expensive stones, the girl proclaimed that money was the most important thing she should be interested in right now. Having calmed down, the girl decided to summarize all that she has, while looking wistfully out the window as if she were already a rich queen with her own castle. The first thing the heroine remembered was that she has a system window that only she can see, and that tells her about the new abilities she gets for evading the plot. And thanks to the fact that the protagonist constantly dodged the original plot of the novel she was reborn into, she got the ability of an F-level summoner, which means that the girl can create some items in her hands. Last night, when the girl finally had this ability, she tried to use magic to create a gold or at least silver ingot, but she was unsuccessful. The girl used magic, wanting to get at least a bronze ingot, but the system again denuded her that she couldn't get these items since her summoner level was still low. The protagonist even cried with despair when the system again replied to her that her level was still too low for her to summon such items. She lay on her bed and couldn't realize what her level was then. Returning to the present, the girl sighed in sadness, for back then it had been a real torment for her, though even now she didn't know what her ability level was or what items she could create. As she sipped her tea, she realized that she needed to summon some small but useful item that matched her small level. The girl began to think hard about what it could be. Meanwhile, at the other end of the room sat a company of noble gossip ladies talking about the main character's divorce and the rumors surrounding it. The blue-haired lady even told her friend that Rosaline had done a poor job as a duchess. In response, the red-haired noblewoman continued to pour oil on the fire, telling everyone that she was probably just kicked out, and Rosalina is now telling everyone about the divorce because she is ashamed. Gesturing with her hand, saying that she is the most important person here, the red-haired girl continued to spread words, saying about the main character that the title of Duchess did not suit her from the very beginning. The girl's sincere words made her other friends chuckle as the lovely ladies who seemed to be discussing something mundane and good. One aristocrat, looking at her tea, decided to confess to everyone that she had heard many times that Artisian's wife was to be Count Brontesa's daughter. It turned out that Count Brontesa's daughter was also sitting in the company of girls. She looked modest, kind, and affectionate, and when everyone started talking about her, she became even sadder. Noticing the sad mood of the lady, the red-haired aristocrat decided to pity her, saying that that evil woman, that is Rosalind, prevented the creation of their beautiful couple. Another lady with blue hair also told the poor girl that she felt sorry for her because she was probably very upset when she couldn't marry her beloved Artisian. While the protagonist was eating chocolate chip cookies and thinking about something of her own, the gossipers beside her kept saying that Rosalina was a real villain who was jealous of everyone. Covering her face with her hands, the white-haired and vulnerable girl who was supposed to become Artisian's wife cried in front of her friends, causing the red-haired lady to support her. The girl with red hair tried to support the crying blonde, telling her that the Duke must be missing her and waiting for her, but in fact, the girl who looked like an innocent sheep was not crying at all, but thinking that the Duke was only hers from the beginning. The blonde began to think hard about why Rosalind would not approach them after all. Usually just one harsh word was enough for her to walk up to them and spill wine on her dress, as had happened once before. Imagining the way she would even beat up those who let her say something bad about her, the blonde hopes to ruin her reputation now that she's pissed off. Pretending to cry bitterly over her unrequited love, the noble blonde was really only thinking about what a dumbass and monkey Rosalina is for acting the way she wants. Not stopping to think about Prince Artisian, whom she happens to dream of, the blonde does not understand how the heroine dares to take him away from her and take her place as the Duke's wife. With a determined look in the distance, the blonde, angry at the protagonist, realized that she will not leave all this alone and will ensure that Rosalind's reputation is at rock bottom. Still playing the innocent sheep, the blonde decided to casually look in the direction where Rosalina was sitting so that all the other girls would then take notice. The girls did indeed notice Miss Rosalina not far away from them, who had been drinking tea the entire time and not even thinking about the people around her. Each of the noble women looked intently at the heroine, but the protagonist of the story also noticed the looks on herself, because of which she turned to the girls and also looked at them, not yet understanding why they were staring at her and what they wanted. In fact, Rosalina looked ordinary, but in the eyes of those gossiping girls, she was still an evil mistress who supposedly looked at them with contempt, though she wasn't. The girls immediately began to whisper that in front of them now is not just Mrs. Rosalind, on the misfortune of Brighton, a villain who killed her mother and put her brother to sleep. The protagonist could not tolerate such rudeness and words in her direction, so angrily banging the cup, she loudly told the girls to stop talking nonsense. However, the red-haired girl folded her arms and immediately asked the protagonist why she had come here at all, and why would they stop talking since they had said nothing of the sort. Rosalina continued to listen to the girls and calmly drank her tea while the other lady dared to tell her that divorce was no reason to be proud. On top of that, the red-haired lady ordered her to stay at home and not show up anywhere if she resented it so much. This surprised and angered the heroine as if her mouth was about to bleed. The noble lady with white hair, who had supposedly been crying before, tried to stop the red-haired girl from insulting Rosalind in a naive way, but in reality she also wanted to make the heroine angry. For one moment she showed her true angry face, thinking that it seems Rosalina was scared of their anger so much that she can't say anything back. To anger Rosalina completely, the girl with red hair dared to point her finger at her and questioned who would want to deal with her now if she is an angry hysteric. Sensing the weakness of the protagonist, the noble lady smilingly told Rosalind that in addition to being kicked out of her home and abandoned by her family, she had also been chased away from the Duke's house. Wanting to touch an intimate life of the protagonist, the red-haired girl decided to tell Rosalind about Earl Bartner, who recently turned 60 and was widowed. The lady hinted to the heroine to marry him because he is looking for a fourth wife. The blonde lady, who supposedly does not want the heroine to be insulted, told her friend Miss Hannah to stop saying such things about Rosalind, for she might get angry. The white-haired lady went on to say that maybe Rosalind wasn't smart enough to marry well, or didn't have a good woman around her, like her mom. In addition, the lady said that everyone should know her by her nickname, the Trouble of Brighton. At this point, it was as if the heroine felt anger and devastation all around her. The protagonist grabbed her chest because she felt a severe pain in her chest that would not let her rest. Imagining as if the former Rosalind was now standing behind her, the protagonist seems to realize the fact that the former feelings of the real Rosalind remained in her body. On the grounds of this, the protagonist stood up from her seat, starting to say that she wanted to just quietly walk out of here without creating anything. While the protagonist was saying her words, the girl who played the innocent sheep was smiling and happy because they had managed to piss off Rosalina after all. But the other gossip girls seemed to be the opposite, wary. They hid their faces behind fans as the protagonist came closer and closer to them. Even the most important red-haired gossip girl, who was looking at Rosalina fearfully and preparing for the worst, became worried. However, the protagonist didn't attack them with words yet, but only asked them why they believed the rumors without checking whether it was true or not. After Rosalina even asked them if they were willing to be held accountable for their every word, the red-haired lady was clearly frightened, not knowing what to say. Pushing the red-haired girl out of the way, Rosalina continued to tell the other lady that, unlike them, she was going to verify the authenticity of the facts. The girl pierced her gaze at the one miss who had started all this. Looking proudly at the very girl who was playing innocent, Rosalina asked her if she really wanted to be betrothed to Artisian, for she should know better than anyone else. But when the lady could not say anything to the protagonist in response, Rosalina only turned around, saying that she understood all this is just a rumor. However, the white-haired girl, from whose forehead sweat was already dripping, decided to tell the heroine that 4 years ago the Duke came to the Bronzen Mansion and there was talk of an engagement. Rosalind watched this and wondered if she really should have dug a little deeper for the girl to start talking about how Artisian would have considered a marriage proposal. Still looking at the girl with white hair, the heroine told her that she realized she had spread false information on purpose, as if he was already her man and she had stolen him from her. The girl also looked at the heroine with tears while she told her that she didn't even have the strength to fight with her because she was a common villain and a liar. Not wanting to get behind the one who had insulted her, Rosalina suddenly slyly asked her if she was the one who happened to lack knowledge in her brain if she was saying such a thing. Affectionately tucking the white-haired lady's hair behind her ear, Rosalina even told her that she should also have a woman to take an example from instead of being a liar. But the words of the heroine of the story only made the white-haired girl angry, because of which she could no longer tolerate the reciprocal bullying. In an instant, the girl raised her hand to hit Rosalina, angrily asking her how she even dares to say such things to her face. And it was at that moment that the protagonist felt a strange, foreign feeling arise in her soul again. Rosalina quickly realized that these are not just feelings, but memories of the past Rosalina, who probably wants the protagonist to stand up for herself now. It took the girl a few seconds to grab the white-haired girl's hand that she was about to hit her with. And after that, Rosalina hit the white-haired lady hard and fast on the cheek with her own hand that she grabbed. After realizing all the events, Rosalina realized that she had overreacted to everything, though she didn't even think she would do that to her. Wanting to get out of the place as soon as possible from shame, the protagonist pointed a finger at the astonished noble lady and ordered her to behave adequately without disturbing people. Everyone around was shocked at what had just happened. At the sight of the blow to the lady, redness appeared and she was also in incredible shock. The protagonist quickly wanted to leave the place in which she allowed herself to hit another noble lady, so she anxiously descended the stairs, realizing that she got into trouble. But at the same time, Rosalind realizes the fact that her fight was a beautiful one. Clenching her hand into a fist, the girl told herself that she realized how to use this skill, and when she arrived home, she would try to practice about it. However, the protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by a masked man who stood nearby and asked her where she was in such a hurry. The heroine of the story was greatly surprised because in front of her stands the guildmaster, whom she had recently seen at a meeting. Taking out an envelope from his clothes, the guildmaster said that he had delivered her the finished contract and reports. But Rosalina was even more surprised by this, since she was supposed to pick up the papers herself. The masked man then looked towards the cafeteria, telling the Jarina that there seemed to be some commotion, but Rosalina was already pushing him away from there so he wouldn't find out anything himself. Artisian looked at the excited lady who was touching him and thanking him for the treaty, clearly thinking about something. And Rosalind herself was looking at him happily, pleasing him with her rich pink eyes. But the masked man did not believe the heroine and so wanted to go to find out what happened in that cafe. But Rosalina kept him all the time, not even letting him move from his seat. After a while, the couple decided to take a walk where there was a beautiful and tall fountain with clear, bubbling water. The head of the guild accompanied the heroine as she looked at the people and prepared to read what was in the envelope. After looking at it, Rosalina was already preparing to open it to read everything carefully. However, the papers only contained reports that did not interest the protagonist. She continued to stare at the masked guild head. Rosalina also could not help but notice that the dark and silent guild leader Hennis was always at her side, holding her by the waist so that the people around her would not disturb her. Once again looking at her escort with a sly and suspicious face, the heroine assumed that the guildmaster had planned all this because he liked her a lot. The girl looked at him with a smile, while the couple themselves strolled through the marketplace. The heroine of the novel thinks about the fact that the guildmaster could not resist her wealth and beauty. But at the same time, Artisian is also looking at Rosaline in disguise, and does not understand why he does not sense from her magic or special skills that interest him in her, because he knows for sure that she uses it. Suddenly for Artisian, the protagonist of the story did not quietly walk beside him, but went around him to stand in front, blocking the way. So far, the masked guild leader doesn't realize anything. The heroine of the Manhwa became in front of him and just looked him in the eyes, as if she wanted to be about to say something important. But for now, she let her eyes calmly look at him as if they were already close friends. After that, Rosalina handed the guild leader the envelope of documents he had given her earlier, with the words that she would allow him to just call her Rosalina. However, Artisian was not yet willing to take the envelope from the cheerful girl's hands. He was greatly surprised by the lady's behavior, which was evident from his twisted face, though it was covered by a mask. All the while, the guild leader was looking at the envelope while the protagonist was telling him that from now on, she didn't want him to call her plain Miss Fieldsden like when she was married. The girl explained her opinion and request by saying that her divorce from the Duke was almost finalized, so there were options to call her Miss Brighton or anything else he liked. But unexpectedly for Rosaline, guild leader Hennis pushed the envelope of papers away from him hard with his hand, saying that he wanted neither. Looking at the girl with an indignant and angry face, the guy replied that he was an overly cautious person and he himself didn't like to do things prematurely. What became clear to the girl was that the man did not agree with her. In addition to that, the guild leader, who is actually Artisian, said that he would only call her that when the divorce process was fully finalized, not when the process was just underway. The man's behavior startled the protagonist and surprised her, but at the same time she did not cross him. She continued to hold the envelope in her hand, agreeing with the words of Guildhead Hannes. The pair continued to walk quietly through the market, turning away from each other because of embarrassment and shyness. Rosalind even assumed that the reason he cared so much was because he didn't like her at all. At this point, the girl realized that such an easy and kind behavior is clearly not like the real, angry, perpetually indignant and rude Rosalina, so she quickly changed her face to be serious. The protagonist decided that from now on she would consider the head of the guild Hennis as an ordinary business partner, not a close friend, as she had previously thought. As the girl walked through the market, her keen sense of smell caught the delicious odor of something fried, which was coming from a small stall nearby, which she looked at. Just by the smell, Rosalina realized that even in this fictional world, where there is magic and aristocrats, there are chicken kebabs, which she loved very much in her past life. The girl only wanted to approach the stall, but the mysterious head of the guild, who quickly realized the fact that chicken kebabs like the heroine, took one and, holding it out to Rosalina, asked the seller how much came out of it. Rosalina did not remain silent and replied that she did not want to remain in debt to him, so she asked him to give it to her, that is, to pay for herself. The silent guild leader did not argue. After a while, the girl was already happily eating her favorite food from her past life, while the masked artisan was already carrying her and fruit juice in a large fruit with a tube. The protagonist also drank the juice that the guildmaster gave her, after which they continued walking through the city. Suddenly, the guildmaster asked Rosalina if she wanted to look at something. Not far away from her, the girl also noticed a strange sculpture that was being sold on a stall. Rosaline immediately pointed her finger at it in surprise, but Artisian was still serious. Thanks to just one walk, Rosalina already had a bag of all sorts of items from the market, which included the statue, juice, and many other things that she liked and just looked at. But that wasn't all, as suddenly the guild leader Hennis stopped near one merchant who clearly had something interesting. A small show awaited the heroes. Right in front of his customers, the vendor took a knife and incised one of his egg-like fruits to show something to the pair. After a few seconds, unique patterns that resembled the eye of some dragon or lizard appeared on the strange fruit where the blade had been cut, which was very beautiful and unusual. The pair continued to walk through the market while Rosalina was constantly learning something new. Apart from the strange fruits, she was also attracted by the vegetables that were also in the market and had strange names. The guild head was also buying anything that interested him, so he gave the sellers silver coins, asking them to give them this and that. Assuming that the guild head was buying all these things for himself, Rosalina looked at him and asked with a smile if he was so hungry that he was interested in these vegetables. However, the masked man, upon whom the sunny, golden light was falling beautifully at that moment, for some reason replied to Rosalina that this was certainly not the case. Soon the heroine of the story realized what plan her business partner had in mind. When the walk was over and the heroine of the story lay in the bed of her bedroom room, she realized what her partner had meant. She looked at the basket full of fruit, realizing that all this he bought just for her. Out of anger, the girl started hitting objects near her, screaming for the guild leader to stop treating her so well, and thinking that behind that mask of his there was probably a unique, handsome man hiding. Besides, the heroine was pissed off that she wasn't thinking about the matters that really mattered to her in the first place. When she was angry, it was like a fire around her, until she could not stop talking herself into thinking only about business and nothing else. At that moment, the girl thought that she needed to summon something small and useful with her new summoner power, and such a thing she considers a rose, which should fit her request. The heroine of the story herself was surprised at how she herself could forget about it, because the whole world is literally obsessed with roses. All the inhabitants of the empire, regardless of status and preferences, just obsessed with them. The empire is full of things that have the usual price when selling, but in the novel you can apply one trick that Rosalina knows. The thing is that if the item has something to do with a rose, its price will go up twice and everyone will want to buy it since they adore this flower. Remembering the girl she had recently seen in the cafe and quarreled with, the protagonist realized that they were also wearing rose jewelry. Literally, all the ladies had rosebuds on them, like jewelry that complemented their delicate and attractive image. Realizing that she has this unusual ability to call objects, the heroine immediately realized that she cannot just create a rose, but to make it an unusual, unique color, which is not yet, thereby getting the money. Having made up her mind to do so, the girl stretched out her hands in front of her, summoning a rose of the most unusual color that only exists or else does not exist in the world. While the magic around her was already adorning the girl's hair, gracefully lifting it upwards, she continued to hold her hands out in front of her and say out loud that she really wished to summon the rose. Still, the protagonist of the story managed to summon the item. As the magic rained around her, she noticed that a rose had indeed appeared above her head and began to descend towards her. Rosalina was already thinking that just because of the rose's most unusual color, she would be able to become the richest girl in the empire. But when she looked closely at the rose itself, her hopes quickly vanished. The girl turned her head to get out of bed, not understanding why a rose that had the most ordinary, common red color was lying in front of her. The protagonist sadly took the rose in her hands, closing her eyes and realizing the saddest news in this whole seemingly bright situation. Right in front of Rosalina was not just an ordinary rose, but an artificial flower that didn't even smell like a real one. This is what upset the young lady even more, shattering her dreams of wealth. Meanwhile, in the other study, Duke Brighton was doing his usual work at his desk, writing something down on sheets while the butler silently brought him tea without disturbing anything. Brighton continued to scribble with his quill on the paper, dabbing the tip into a can of ink while there was a suspiciously dead silence all around. It was this silence that began to alarm the Duke of Brighton. He raised his head, looking around carefully, but saying nothing as yet. The butler quietly placed the desserts from the cart on the Duke's table, while the gentleman told him that it had become suspiciously quiet around him, especially when Rosalind appeared in the house. Approaching the Duke, the butler wanted to clarify with his master if he meant that it had become quiet. The Duke of Brighton only muttered something. Looking at the hot tea that poured from the spout of the white teapot directly into the cup, Duke Brighton decided to ask the butler how his daughter Rosalind was doing. Wiping the hot teapot with a clean towel, the bald servant with the monocle answered his master that so far there was nothing special and everything was as usual. At that moment, however, the door to the Duke of Brighton's study was ajar. This meant that the servant had something to say to him, and it was always something very important. However, it was not the servant, but Mrs. Rosalind herself, who looked out from behind the door and immediately apologized for disturbing someone's peace. The Duke and the butler immediately turned their attention to the heroine of the story, piercing her with glances. The girl at this time came closer to them and said that she wanted to discuss something. At these words, the Duke of Brighton reacted calmly, but the butler, on the contrary, became agitated. He recalls how such visits Rosalind usually ended in scandals in the family, but here she came to say something. Rosalind also noticed the butler's ambiguous reaction to her words, which made her wonder why they were so agitated. But because of that, she herself forgot what she wanted to say at first. The protagonist assumed that she had to knock first in order to enter, so she awkwardly knocked on the door, trying to remedy the situation. But Rosalind was surprised when the Duke of Brighton didn't scold her for anything, only asking what exactly she wanted to tell them. The daughter looked at her father with rather surprised eyes. The protagonist decided to get right into the conversation, so she asked if her father's birthday was coming up soon. The Duke of Brighton was surprised, as if he himself had forgotten about his important holiday. The girl came even closer to her father while her hands were constantly at his back. She began her monologue by saying that she had never actually given Duke Brighton any gifts. It turns out that behind her back the girl held a small but important gift, which was nicely wrapped in pink paper and decorated with a golden ribbon. So the protagonist handed the Duke of Brighton the gift, which she immediately opened. She said that she was giving it to him for his future birthday. The Duke of Brighton immediately took the gift pen in his hands, examining each side of it. Rosalind asked her father if the pen was beautiful, beginning also to tell him something else. The girl could not fully say her sentence, as her father immediately took it in his right hand to check how she would write. As it turned out, the protagonist was in a hurry to tell her dad the fact that this pen does not write. It's just not real, but it's made of real gold. After that, the heroine of the Manhwa grabbed her hands and looked at the Duke with her excited eyes and asked if this pen was cool because of that. The Duke of Brighton was quite puzzled as to the real purpose for the pen, which it did not appear to be. He told his daughter that he was surprised at both the gift and herself. After that, the heroine of the Manhwa looked at the bouquet of flowers that stood in the Duke of Brighton's study and honestly admitted that she was not quite mature before. Saying the sincere words, Rosalina tilted her head down while smiling, confessing to her father that she wanted to show everyone how much she had changed during this time. Outside the window, a light and pleasant wind was blowing, pounding the sheer curtains in the Duke's study. The father thanked his daughter for giving him such attention. He decided to put his daughter's gift in a gold stand for a golden capitalized pen, which now adorned his desk as a colorful accessory. The Duke of Brighton continued writing his papers, while not stopping to think about the sudden change in his daughter's behavior, which, fortunately, did not seem to be bad. Rosalind's father even occasionally looked at the gold pen his daughter had given him. He was worried about one question. Did he deserve this gift from his own daughter, or did he not? Remembering the past, the Duke of Brighton realizes that he always turned away from Rosalind, even when she was a child, all because of her behavior. Realizing the difficulty of the situation, Brighton covered his face with the palm of his hand, wondering if Rosalind used to be like this just because he was a terrible parent to her. This made the Duke of Brighton seriously think to the point where he put his work aside, stopping to write something. In his silence, he understood what he could not understand from talking to his daughter all these years. However, the musings of the lord of the house were interrupted by a maid who turned loudly to the Duke as if something terrible had happened. The aristocrat immediately turned his attention to her. Shy with embarrassment, the red-haired maid said something to her master that she had something to tell him that would surely make him angry. Frowning his eyebrows with rage, the Duke of Brighton asked the maid if she had something to tell him about Rosalind. The guesses of the father of the story's heroine's father turned out to be correct. At this time, the protagonist of the story was already standing in front of the door, which she wanted to open, thereby getting into the room she wished. But in her way stood two maids, who did not even let her pass. Rosalind held a bouquet of roses in her hand, telling the maids that it was strange that they would not let her pass, for it was her house, and she had the right to enter wherever she wished. Looking at the girls with a look that could easily frighten them, Rosalind asked them why this house was full of things she should not, or could not, enter. Playing sadness and disappointment, the heroine confessed that she simply wanted to decorate her mother's room with these flowers, for Beatrice had been very fond of flowers in her lifetime. However, one of the maids firmly and menacingly said that this should not be done, as no one was allowed to enter the late Beatrice's room. In addition, the maid also said that this rule applied to everyone and had no exceptions. At this time, another maid with long bangs was standing beside her. In fact, while Rosalind couldn't see anything, this maid was smiling slyly, for she's laughing at her and realizing that she has no power here, and they just need to stall until the Duke comes and scolds her again. Things were already starting to get heated between the maids and Rosalind, but one of the maids really wanted the Duke of Brighton to notice the absurdity of the situation. Remembering Rosalind's dark nature, the maid also remembers that when she entered her mother's room, she broke all the things as if something had come over her. For this reason, the maid thinks that the Duke will not forgive her for this. Also, the maid of the house doesn't understand how anyone could be so evil as to ask one maid to make herself a bouquet of roses. Who is actually cursed because of the roses? The maid realizes that if Rosalina continues to do such a thing, she will definitely be kicked out of the palace. While the maid was standing there thinking about how bad Rosalind is in her eyes, the protagonist herself comes closer to her and tells her that it looks like she's waiting for someone. Leaning over to the maid and placing a hand on her shoulder, Rosalind angrily asked her if she was waiting for the Duke to arrive, who was supposedly to scold her. Hearing this, the maid became wary. Then Rosalind calmly said that in that case they would wait for his arrival together. The girl even asked the maids when he would come to scold her. The words of the mistress alarmed the maid very much. She realizes that all this is not according to plan and she was about to do something bad, but Rosalind is still standing by the door. The protagonist herself thought to herself, asking the maid what she will do now, because now she is not doing something terrible, for which she is usually scolded. Right after that, the heroine of the story heard behind her how someone was already running towards her, breaking her legs, as if she had already done something to her late mother's room. The Duke of Brighton shouted his daughter's name so loudly that the heroine jerked from her seat. She was frightened and even thought she had seriously done something he was already angry with her for. The door in the hallway was opened by the protagonist's father, who looked at Rosalina and could not catch his breath, constantly inhaling and exhaling air. What shocked the girl's father even more was that she was about to go to the room of the late Beatrice with a bouquet of roses, which he noticed in the heroine's hand. Noticing the silent rage in her father's eyes, Rosalind immediately anxiously asked him what she had done, because in fact she was just standing with flowers outside her late mother's room. The Duke of Brighton, however, would not listen to her. He came closer and, swinging his hand, struck it on the heroine's bouquet, causing it to slip out of her hands. The bouquet of roses, which the girl wanted to leave in the room of the late Beatrice, tragically fell to the floor, causing some of the petals to detach from the buds and sadly fell to the floor. The protagonist looked at the bouquet, which her father had thrown right from her hands and which could no longer adorn anyone's room or vase. To Rosalind's surprise, her father took her by the arms and began furiously asking her if she was feeling all right and if she had any pain. The protagonist's face read amazement and shock, Because the protagonist didn't even know what to say, she just opened her mouth and mumbled something short, not understanding what her father wanted her to say. At this point, the heroine realized that it would be good to start by making it clear to the readers why going to Beatrice's room at all and what it was for. The heroine says that it's really simple. The thing is, she wants to find out a lot more backstory in the novel she's reborn. It's actually titled Tyrants Demand a Divorce Because of Me. And it is in the backstory of this book that the girl wants to find something as precious as the golden key that she introduced in the paperback of her novel. In this book, the story has already come to a point where a girl who has light-colored shoes and dresses appeared in front of Brighton Castle. The girl with long brown hair was peering into the garden of Brighton Castle. It looks like she clearly wants to enter it, but is afraid to do so for now. This girl turned out to be the protagonist of the novel, a girl named Daisy whose hair was gently blown by the wind and whose gaze never stopped looking at the palace. Suddenly, the protagonist was occluded by the villainous Rosalind herself, who came very close to her and said that she had come to her after all. You can see from Daisy that she is quite afraid of her friend. The innocent protagonist of the novel replied to Mrs. Rosalind that she had received her letter and read in it that she was in great danger. To this, the wicked witch Rosalind said that this was indeed true, and most importantly, she wanted to clear up a misunderstanding, which happened in the Bluestone mine. The villain of the novel then told Daisy to follow her, and both young ladies went to Brighton Castle for some purpose. While Daisy walked modestly down the corridor, silently looking around, Rosalind, on the contrary, was twisting and waving her arms, telling her friend that she had wanted to show her family's estate for a very long time. The villainess even told the book's protagonist not to be shy and look at everything she liked. However, after Mistress Daisy's sincere words, she did not turn her head and smile. She looked worriedly at Rosalina and told her that she did not look good, because of which she suggested that she rest. But the pink-haired fiend only looked at her friend with a look that read like some kind of plan, and then told Daisy that she shouldn't worry about it. The girls walked down the hallway while Rosalina told a slightly scared Daisy that she was very good and kind. As they both walked past the candle lamp, Rosalind was the first to offer to talk about her. Remembering the events of the past, namely when Rosalind pushed Daisy into the lake, the villainess told the heroine of the novel that after she did so, she immediately began to call for help. Continuing down the corridor, Rosalind said that while she was calling for help, Daisy herself found a lot of jewelry at the bottom of the lake. The villainess asked her partner if this wasn't an interesting coincidence to her. Not lagging behind Rosalind, who was actually smiling slyly, the villainess confessed honestly, saying that she was very jealous of Daisy. To this, the novel's protagonist, Daisy, replied with a smile that it was all just because of Rosalind and she really shouldn't be so jealous. Opening the door to a room unknown to Daisy, Rosalind said that she was very grateful to her and then informed her that she really wanted to thank her with one gift. Both girls entered the room where everything was neatly folded and clean. Daisy slowly guesses that this is the room of Rosalind's late mother. The villain of the novel's story went to a table with various items and started looking for something, telling her friend that this is the room of the deceased Beatrice, her mother. But in addition, Rosalind for some reason immediately told Daisy that it is forbidden to enter here. This alarmed the heroine of the novel even more, because of which she asked the villain why so. Completely unexpectedly for Daisy, Rosalind, with her hands in a flash, demolished all the objects with anger, which previously lay on the nightstand. Turning to the protagonist of the novel, the evil Rosalina, who was mad with anger, asked her rival if she thought she could escape like the last rat this time too. Immediately after, Rosalina pushed Daisy with all her might, causing her to scream and almost fall to the floor, trying to barely stay on her feet. After a strong push back, Daisy hit the stone statue, which was also in the room of the late Beatrice. The girl screamed in pain, feeling great fear for her life. The villain of the novel, Rosalind, was already doing something behind the heroine's back with a wicked smile, while Daisy herself apparently felt something strange when she started standing next to the mystical statue. After a while, Rosalind had already made her father go to Beatrice's room, telling him that she had slapped her on the arm and Daisy had shown her true colors. It wasn't really like that. As soon as the wily villainess approached the room where Daisy was to be, she noticed something that struck her in an instant. A look of obvious shock and incomprehension appeared on Rosalind's face. The fact is that Rosalind noticed in the doorway, villain noticed an unusual and very bright light that came from the room where the heroine of the novel was. Rosalind has no idea what exactly she will see there. From the room of the late Beatrice came out a girl whose clothes were still snow-white and clean. It was Daisy, who had not sustained any injuries. Not realizing anything, Daisy walked out of her late mother Rosalind's bedroom, looking at everyone and not realizing where she was now. To make matters worse, in her palms she was carrying something that glowed with the same magical light. Unexpectedly for the Duke of Brighton, Rosalind and many others who were watching Daisy, they noticed that magic began to happen around her as well. An unusual sign appeared on the girl's forehead that clearly meant something important. But besides the sign, the egg that the girl was holding in her hands also glowed with an unusual pattern, clearly saying that Daisy was not an ordinary heroine, but a gifted, magical girl. The Duke of Brighton, who had been watching all this, was in amazement at what he saw. He looked at Daisy with stunned eyes and mumbled that it was the very sign of the fairy that had long ago disappeared. Looking at the protagonist of the novel, from which continued to emanate a bright light, along with an unusual sign on her forehead, the Duke of Brighton solemnly said that the fairy mark has chosen a new owner. The fact is that the fairy mark is an old and important relic of the Brighton family, which has long since disappeared. It should never be missed, so it is likely that Daisy has become a special person for the Brighton family. Rosalind recalls all of this from the novel as she stares at the door to her late mother's room. She realizes that in the story, whoever enters that room will receive this magical symbol on their forehead, some kind of gift, so she can't wait to get in there first. Back in the present, when the main character of the manhwa refused to be allowed into her mother's room with flowers, Rosalind continued to stare at her worried father while maids stood nearby and guarded the entrance to Beatrice's chambers to the end. Duke Brighton explained to his daughter that asking this girl to make a bouquet is very dangerous, as Ansoni is a child suffering from the curse of the rose that is spreading throughout the empire. In fact, the protagonist of the manhwa has never heard of the curse of the rose and the fact that any touch of this flower can bring trouble upon her, because when she read the novel, nowhere was it mentioned. The girl truly realizes that one touch of the rose could endanger her life, which is a very serious problem. But at the same time, an almost ingenious plan is maturing in her mind. Looking at the door, which the protagonist could not open, thus missing the opportunity to see her mother, she listened to the maid, who told the Duke that not only did she make the maid take care of the roses, but she insisted on entering Beatrice's room. As the maid continues to speak, she tells the nobleman with a serious face that only today they have caught Rosalind in the act, but it is not known whether she has come here before. Remembering Beatrice's room, which has been empty of people and uninhabited for a very long time, the maid, with a dismissive attitude towards Rosalind, said that lately things have started disappearing mystically in this very room, and they don't know who the culprit is. However, when the maid who was angry with the protagonist told the Duke that people do not change, implying that all this could have been done by the overbearing, selfish, evil Rosalind, the mood of the protagonist herself plummeted. Because of such loud words, she even wanted to object to the maid who had just called her a thief. She looked at her with an indignant look and said that it was all wrong and they should hear her out before accusing her. But the Duke of Brighton, the protagonist's father, didn't let the girl say anything because he clearly had a few questions for the maid. He turned to her and grudgingly asked if she knew what she should watch out for in the first place. The maid didn't even realize what the aristocrat meant. Not getting a clear answer from the servant, Rosalind's father turned to the maid and shouted at her that she should first of all watch out for his daughter's safety, not tell him about the missing things and how bad she was. To remind the maid of another important message, the Duke told her that Rosaline was also suffering from the curse of the rose, so she too could die at any moment. Daddy's words made the heroine fall in amazement because she herself did not know about it. To frighten and teach the maid even more, the Duke of Brighton told him that he did not want to hear any excuses from her when she so negligently neglected her real duties. The frightened maid wanted to say something to the aristocrat, but was afraid to. As he was about to leave, the Duke of Brighton said angrily that until he made some kind of decision about the maid, it would be best to lock her in the dungeon. Immediately afterward, the maids grabbed the maid while she tried to change the Duke's mind about not doing so. However, the protagonist was not upset by this. She thought a little about the whole situation, realizing that she was sorry that a well-thought-out plan had failed so badly, but it did not really sadden her much. The girl gathered the flowers that had separated from the bouquet she had so wished to give to her late mother. At the same time, she thought about the fact that it would all work out for her. The protagonist still calmly touched the roses, even though she already knows about the curse of the rose. She thinks about the fact that right now, the main part of her plan is left. After Rosalina took the last rose in her hands, the girl held out the beautiful flower to the Duke of Brighton and said that there was nothing to be afraid of since it was only an artificial flower. The father looked away from the flower a little, but still decided to believe his daughter. The Duke of Brighton decided to take the flower in his hand, which, according to the heroine, is artificial. The protagonist's dad even admitted that it was the first time he had ever seen something like this. Convinced that her father trusts her, the protagonist of the Manhwa decided to try her luck again and asked the Duke of Brighton if she could leave this artificial bouquet in her mother's room if he trusted her. Right in front of the young, joyful lady, the Duke of Brighton inserted the missing artificial flower into the bouquet to make it look even more beautiful and complete. After this, the father of the protagonist in the story did open the door to the late Beatrice's room, after which he turned to Rosaline and sternly told her to follow him. The father's words pleased the protagonist so much that she immediately wanted to follow him, looking at him with sparkling eyes and showing her joyful smile. The heroine is glad that she was able to achieve what she wanted from the beginning. After a while, father and daughter were already spending time in the room of the mother, who died long ago, having sacrificed her life to Rosaline. The Duke of Brighton and Rosaline were looking at a portrait of Beatrice, who was holding the still very young protagonist in her arms. Rosaline was also able to place and own a bouquet of artificial roses, which now stood in a vase on a table and decorated the already beautiful bedroom of Rosaline's mother. In addition, the girl looked at the statue, which touched Daisy in the original plot of the novel, and because of which she received the mark of the fairy on her forehead. Of course, the protagonist of the Manhwa also had such a plan, so she did not leave the statue trying to find the right moment for her plan. But when the heroine just had the chance to take at least one step towards her plan to get the coveted fairy mark, the Duke of Brighton himself took her by the collar, forcing her to go along with him. Because of this, the protagonist had to listen to her father's long monologue about all sorts of Brighton family facts, while he showed her the patterns on the walls in Beatrice's room and many more different things around. In addition to all sorts of things, the Duke of Brighton told Rosaline everything that was in the books, inviting the girl to read for herself and scrutinize all the features of their noble family. When the Duke of Brighton had told everything he wanted to, Rosaline pointed her finger at something that had been of great interest to her all along, asking her father if she could enter the one door near the statue. When her father was about to leave on his own business, he did allow the girl to do what she so desired. Immediately afterward, Rosalina, sighing with slight fatigue, entered the room, closing the door tightly behind her. She realizes that right now she will be able to do what she wanted to enter her mother's room for. The protagonist was quickly able to find the very box, which all this time stored a valuable magical egg, which will give her magic and know the fairies. The girl carefully opened the box, looking at its contents. After the girl opened the box, she took out the very egg that would grant her magical powers. She held it gently in her hand, even talking to it like a baby, saying hello to it. Rosalina was interested in looking at every pattern on its surface, so she also gently touched it with her fingers, saying that from now on they were close friends to each other. Trying to manifest on her forehead the cherished sign that appears on all the special ones, Rosalina felt the symbol really appeared on her face, and the egg glowed with a magical light. However, a few seconds were enough for the sign on her forehead to disappear as quickly as it appeared. The girl wiped her forehead, not understanding anything, but at the same time she was glad about it because she didn't really need it now, but it would come in handy later. The next day in the world of the novel, in which the protagonist found herself, was not as bright as the previous one. Thick and dark clouds hovered over the empire, which shed a large and heavy downpour on the ground. Large drops fell from the sky and hit the asphalt, creating many splashes and turning into a stream that poured down the beautifully paved road. But despite the weather, Rosalina still decided to go outside for business. The girl looked up at the sky in surprise and stretched her palm forward to feel the many raindrops falling on her. She was surprised by the weather, but at the same time she wasn't going to just stand there and wait for it to pass. Rosalind stood outside the castle in a light blue outfit and with her purse at her side, realizing that because of the servants she could barely make it out of the Brighton family's castle, even in such bad weather. The protagonist recalls that Ansoni, a maid suffering from the curse of the rose, kept urging her not to go anywhere, preventing her from even taking a single step. Rosalind thinks that she will still hear more questions from her about why she is going somewhere without guards and assistants. However, when the heroine of the Manhwa was about to go about her business, she suddenly felt the fact that right behind her appeared a man in dark boots who clearly came closer to her. The protagonist only had to turn around when she saw in front of her a similarly surprised guild leader, Hannes, whose red eyes were looking straight into her eyes. The master of the best guild in the empire was masked as always, but that didn't stop Rosalina from seeing his astonished eyes. He called out to the heroine, calling her Miss Fieldsden as if to ask what she was doing here. Rosalina, the astonished girl, similarly looked at the head of the guild with round pink eyes, hesitating and asking him what he was doing here. Each of them wasn't going to answer the questions first, so the pair just stared at each other as if they were seeing each other for the first time. Each of them marveled at the unexpected meeting and how fate had brought them together again. Realizing that the sincere looks lasted too long, Rosalina blushed, but what surprised her even more was what the guild leader was going to do in the next moment. He cared a lot about the fact that the girl was standing here alone, also in the rain. Right in front of the lady, the guild leader, Henny, began to take off his light blue coat, while the protagonist looked at him and did not understand what her partner in an important case wanted to do. After a second, the guild leader threw his blue coat that he had taken off before over the protagonist's head and body. Like a true gentleman, he doesn't want the lady to get wet in the heavy rain, so he doesn't mind protecting her from the water this way. After that, pointing backwards with his thumb, the guild leader told Rosalina that his carriage is in that direction, and he will take her where she needs to go. For the heroine, this is a real good fortune, because she won't have to get somewhere in a downpour. The girl adjusted the guild head's coat on her body, also hooding her head. She did not refuse such an offer, but only briefly said that in that case, she urgently needed to go to Duke Filesden's mansion. A short time later, when the guild leader Hennes and Rosaline were already riding in his carriage, the masked man held out his palm to the girl, telling her that she could now return his coat. Rosalina, who was sitting across from the head of the guild, was surprised at her colleague's words, especially when he repeated his words that she needed to return his clothes. All this time, Artisian's coat had been on the protagonist's lap. Before doing anything, Rosalina touched her chin with the palm of her hand, portraying thoughtfulness. She curiously asked the guild head if he happened to have a close relationship with another woman. At the moment when the curious heroine asked this, the guild head was unaware of anything and sat quietly, not even thinking that his client would ask him such a personal question about his intimate life. But after the man heard the question, everything that was in his mind before seemed to disappear. He fell into a stupor, not even knowing what to answer the young lady. He looked at her with his mouth ajar, because in fact she does not know that she is such a woman for him. However, in order not to mislead the protagonist even more, the head of the guild, that is, Artisian, replied that he does not have such a woman. This raised Rosalina's mood, and she smiled, asking if it was true. It turns out that the girl asked this only to put the guild leader's blue coat back on with the words that she would wash it soon and then return it to his hands. But even that didn't satisfy Artisian. Artisian dared to take the lady's own coat away from her, making attempts to pull it off the protagonist's body, telling her not to show off and just give it back now. But Rosalina continued to insist on her own, indignantly asking the head of the guild what he was allowing himself. But after the grown man failed to take back his own coat from the frail lady, the guild head wiped his forehead with sweat, saying that it was better to ask Rosalina herself about it, since she was a married woman who allows herself to keep another man's coat on herself. This made the protagonist of the Manhwa smile so much that she wasn't afraid to look at the disgruntled guild head with a satisfied smile, as if she had won the argument and duel for the blue coat. Rosalind straightened her back and, by doing so, corrected the beautiful and large blue coat of her interlocutor, and said that she had something to tell the head of the guild about her marriage to the Duke of Filesden. In fact, the protagonist of the manhwa was so excited about what she was about to say to the head of the guild that she looked at him with a genuine smile, saying that she thought she would get the freedom of marriage sooner than she thought herself. But these words didn't even smile and please the guild head, because he himself is her husband, on whom it directly depends on whether the protagonist will be free or not. He looked thoughtfully out the window, clearly plotting something bad for Rosalind. The girl was able to calmly reach the castle of the Duke of Fieldston, where she was already anticipating to receive from her ex-husband the final authorization for divorce. But what was her surprise when she heard from the Duke that the divorce was canceled? These words for the heroine sounded like thunder in the middle of an already dark sky. Immediately after that, Duke Fieldston, who is actually the head of the guild, asked the protagonist where the check, which was the first installment. Rosalina excitedly replied that she had successfully spent all the money at the recent auction. However, Artisian, placing his elbows on the table, which also held a notebook and several jars of ink, said that this very check served as a notarial proof of divorce, and without it, it was impossible to get a divorce. Rosalind did not tolerate and instantly shouted at Artisian that this is all nonsense, because they both agreed to break off the marriage, and this is all generally just outrageous. But Duke Artisian replied that the outrageous thing was not that, but that she had secured her wedding by lying and then spent the night with him. After that, the Duke also asked whether the protagonist even had the right to such words. For the girl, the new information was a real shock. Most likely it is because of this that the Duke is angry with her, but at the same time she does not understand why it was necessary to arrange all this then. Also, when the downpour continued to pour sadly outside the window, the Duke, who looked at the heroine and sat at the table, said that in his opinion then she may change her mind about divorce, and only because of this will appeal the decision on divorce under the pretext of the lack of a check. Artisian said that he did not need it, and after that asked the heroine to understand him. From anger and hopelessness, Rosalina did not even know what to say. She clenched her hands into fists, frowned, and began to think harder about how he could get out of this situation. Already mastered in her head an unusual plan, Rosalina raised her head and looked at her husband, with whom she wanted to divorce, telling him that in this case she could write a receipt that she would not try to annul the divorce and notarize everything. The girl's words made Duke Artisian hesitate. He did not say anything, reflecting on the words of his ex-wife, and this pleased the protagonist, because it gave hope that he would agree with her. Sweat was already running down the forehead of the protagonist, while in her mind, Rosalind, almost on her knees, begged Duke Artisian to allow her to divorce, because this is the most important goal she needs to achieve in the novel. But Artisian only threw the protagonist of the manhwa out the door of his office, before telling her that they must see each other next time, and Rosalind must necessarily be with the check, which traded in the auction. All this upset the girl greatly. She was shaking, barely restraining herself from walking into Artisian's office and punching him with rage, as he had just ruined literally her entire life she had been reborn into. Raising her head up and clenching her hand into a fist, an exasperated Rosalina furiously whispered how much Artisian pissed her off and how much she hated him. The girl behaved as quietly as possible so that her ex-husband did not hear her nasty words. But while the protagonist tried to release all her anger at will, right in front of her appeared the very system window, which was already preparing to notify her of something bad. To the surprise and fear of the manhwa's protagonist, the system window alerted her to some sort of penalty for accepting a failed attempt at divorce. Rosalina doesn't understand anything about those words yet. Looking at the system window that only she can see, Rosalina asked that the penalty for a failed attempt at divorce would be in the form of forced adherence to fate in an affair. The girl lowered her head as goosebumps seemed to run through her body. She realizes that now she will still follow the plot in the novel, even if she doesn't want to do something. Realizing the direness of the situation, Rosalina rushed towards a place where she thought she could definitely get help. As she ran past various stores with signs, she calmed herself by thinking that she could get 1,000,000 gold coins somewhere. As usual, the heroine placed a chess piece in the shape of a king on the table, telling the manager that she urgently needed to meet with the head of the Hennis Guild. Rosalina didn't even wait for an invitation, but stormed into the guild head's room, where Artisian was already there in disguise. The heroine appeared at his back and loudly said that he had something to do. The girl even came closer to the guild head, aggressively and indignantly asking him if he could hear her words. It turns out that the master had been reading a book the whole time, but then he turned to Rosalina and said he could hear her. While the protagonist was already seated at the table, Guildhead Hennis asked her what the purpose of her visit was. So far, the lady was in no hurry to say everything until she was seated. After the protagonist sat down at the round table and placed her hand on it, she wanted to start telling the man with a smile what he should help her with. But the girl couldn't even utter a word after she felt a strong pain in her stomach from not having eaten anything since morning. While the master put the book on the table, Rosalina lay down on the table, asking him if he had anything to eat. Artisian reflected that this was all getting interesting for him. Turning to the heroine of the Manhwa, the guild leader first told her that this was a secret hidden location with only him and at most a few people. Even the entrance to this place is where ordinary people don't go, and even the locals sometimes can't find it. Looking at the furniture he had in his room, the guild leader warned the hungry girl that because of this, he didn't have many workers, and so the food wouldn't be good. Rosalind was also surprised that Guildmaster Hennis came closer to her, and placing his hand on the table, said whether it was okay that they would not be able to meet the tastes of a noble lady like her. The man's words made the heroine smile. She leaned her face against his hand, understanding the master's humor and looking at him with kind, sweet eyes. Looking kindly at the head of the guild who had agreed to feed the hungry lady after all, Rosalina ordered him not to talk anymore and to carry at least something as soon as possible. After a while, the girl received what she had longed for. First of all, she was served flavored bread, with which, as Rosalina thinks, absolutely all problems go away. Holding a wooden knife in her hands, the girl took a large amount of butter with it to generously spread it on the fragrant bread. Covering literally the entire slice of bread with butter, the girl thought that this was enough to have true happiness. Adding natural honey to her unsurpassed dish, the girl continues to think of herself as a professional chef. Mole, it should be added only according to her own taste. In addition, if you whisk it all in a unique mushroom soup, which is also kindly served to her by the servants of the head of the guild, you will get the best combination of flavors. The protagonist had already tasted the bread and butter, about to taste the flavor she'd been dreaming of all day while she was hungry. The girl smilingly acknowledged the fact that it was real yummy, while behind her stood the calm guild leader Henna, who was also carrying 2 wooden mugs to the girl. Rosalina looked happily at all the delicious food that the guild master had brought her and thought about the fact that she was actually afraid of him because she thought he would bring her simple bread and that with mold. But to the heroine's surprise and suspicion, she received a rather sumptuous meal. At this time, she was quietly chewing the bread and butter in her mouth. Rosalina also asked if he wanted more sandwiches, but the masked artisan only waved his hand, saying he could do without it. The main character even laughed with the man, pointing her finger at him as if Artisian was the truest comedian in her eyes. In fact, Duke Artisian can't figure out if this woman was always like this, or if she was switched by someone that he is now surprised by her kind, unaccustomed behavior. Looking at the table, Artisian thinks about the fact that in his opinion she would refuse to eat and call him a brute, but right in front of him she laughs, showing that everything is fine. Picturing an angry Rosalind in his mind, Artisian remembers how angry this girl became when someone didn't follow her orders. He even thought that this nice lady would throw the whole table over on him, but now she is sitting calmly eating the dishes like a nice girl. Artisian realizes that Rosalind, whom he has known and married for so long, would only do such a thing, but all this did not happen. The Duke even throws back his head and wonders if she was really herself then, or was she not? Realizing that it was already quite late, the head of the guild told the girl that they had to get down to business a long time ago, but Rosalina did not listen to him and poured the drink into mugs. Suddenly, the lady held out a mug to her companion, asking him with a smile if he would drink with her. Duke Artisian was again surprised by this, but he remained silent, simply taking the other mug in his hands. The pair then clinked their mugs with their drink, but it was also at this moment that Rosalina solemnly said that their big business was starting from this moment. While Duke Artisian did not pony up what business Rosaline meant and what it was all about, the girl herself rejoiced as if their partnership had already begun. She showed him her kind smile and a friendly gesture with her palm. Artisian decided not to pester the girl with questions, instead continuing to drink his beer, looking at Rosalina, who was already pulling out of her small blue purse what she thought was very important. Rosalina had to do a good poking around, telling the guild leader that what she was about to pull out could safely be called the main item of the day. Artisian has no idea what it could be, but what the girl pulled out of her bag made him very surprised. It seems that fear for the protagonist even appeared on his face, because the item she is holding could ruin her life. Without hesitation, Guildmaster Hennes slapped the hand of the astonished Rosalina, causing her object to fall to the floor. Artesian's behavior also surprised the heroine, which was readable in her round eyes. The object that Duke Artesian dreaded turned out to be the most ordinary rose, because of which a curse is widespread in the Empire. Because of this, the man was frightened, causing Rosalind to throw the flower on the floor. Immediately after that, the alarmed guild leader Hennes began to touch the face of the uncomprehending protagonist with his hands, asking her if she was feeling well, and continuing to talk about the curse of the rose. The girl couldn't help but notice the way her business colleague and usual business partner was worried about her, as if she were his own wife or sister. Rosalina looked the stranger in the eyes, realizing that he was still as anxious as ever. However, it took the protagonist only a few minutes to explain to the frightened man that the rose was artificial and posed no danger. Realizing his mistake, the guild leader hurriedly picked up the flower from the floor and gave it to the girl. Returning to the conversation itself and showing her colleague her artificial rose, Rosalina said that this rose was almost like a real rose, and no one would notice the difference between a real flower from which you can get a curse. Artisian quickly realized that this was the blueprint for sales success. Counting something on the accounts, the head of the guild did not stop talking and continued to say everything for Rosalina, telling her that if this product is made premium and put into mass production, then the price for it can soar to the sky, which, respectively, entails a large profit. The protagonist was happy that her partner understood her thoughts half-heartedly. She happily clapped her hands, telling the masked man that he truly read her mind. When the couple was able to understand each other's intentions, the masked Duke Artisian sat down at the table and immediately offered the heroine a contract with the Hennes Guild to start a business. The heroine was interested and offered to negotiate the terms. At this rate, the head of the Henna Guild and Rosalina were able to skillfully close the deal, creating a win-win business and the flower empire itself. After her visit to Artisian, the protagonist returned to the Brighton family's castle, which had a clear blue sky. The next day came. Rosalind, like a real princess in a beautiful castle, spent the night in bed while she dreamed the most different, vivid dreams. She woke up on the soft bed in her bedroom, already feeling her unkempt and tangled long hair. Rising from the bed, the girl didn't even hurry to open her eyes, because she had literally just woken up. Under her eyes were bruises from fatigue, but at the same time her hearing for some reason did not pick up any noise that she usually hears from behind the maids. The protagonist opened her eyes and looked out the window, which was not curtained. There she saw a white bird on a branch that was chirping as if for her. But Rosalind was concerned about one thing. Why was the castle so quiet? Curiosity took over, and soon Rosalind was already walking down the corridor, trying to meet at least some maid in the mansion. She even called for the maid Ansoni, who was usually always with her, but she didn't even show up. However, Rosalina still found something that interested her. She looked toward the first floor as she descended the stairs, because there she heard suspicious and quiet female conversations. Downstairs, the protagonist noticed several maids at once who, judging by the buckets of water and mops, were scrubbing the floors in the hall. They were talking quietly and anxiously among themselves as to which of them would go to Miss Rosalind's room. One of the girls, holding a shwarba in her hand, answered fearfully at once that she would not go to Miss Rosalind's room, as she had visited her yesterday. It seems that the girls are behaving for the reason that they are still very much afraid of Miss Rosalind because of her character. Another maid with bangs and brown hair said that in that case, no one would even want to go near the protagonist's bedroom to avoid getting unpleasant words from her. Rosalind herself only had to listen to what the frightened gossipers on the first floor were saying. She crouched on the stairs, watching them from afar to see why the house was so quiet. It turns out the girls weren't just talking about Rosalind and their fear of her. One of the maids realizes that the head maid has been captured by the Duke, but the group of haters of Mistress Rosalind has not yet disintegrated. At this time, the protagonist of the Manhwa was sitting on the steps, tucking her knees under her, and continuing to watch the chatty girls. She was very curious as to why things had suddenly changed so much, especially their behavior. The maid remembered how their main maid had been captured and thought that after such an event they should be very quiet at least for a while, so as not to repeat the fate of the one who was already in the dungeon. But the maid's thoughts were interrupted by the fact that she was still able to notice something suspicious on the stairs. The girl immediately realized that someone was eavesdropping nearby. Her intuition did not fail her, as she could see the pink-haired, always angry mistress on the stairs, who was looking at them intently, listening to what they were saying. Immediately telling their friends this, the girls began to whisper to each other, looking at Rosalind as if she were their enemy, though in fact she is. They feel awkward and afraid, so plan to leave now. A moment later, those girls who had just discussed Rosalina and were afraid of her grabbed their mop buckets and hurried away from the eyes of the protagonist. The maid's behavior greatly surprised Rosalina. Rosalina escorted the girls with a look and could not understand why they decided to just run away from her if she is not just a mistress, but the daughter of their employer who provides them with a salary. The girl doesn't understand why she doesn't hear even a trivial apology from them. Playing back their angry faces and smiles in her head, Rosalina began to think more diligently about why they suddenly felt so self-righteous and what was driving them. Remembering the one who always has a sly smile on her face adorned with painted lips, Rosalina wondered who exactly was making the maids make all these decisions as if they had strong outside support. But the protagonist's diligent speculation about one woman was interrupted by the maid, who suddenly appeared behind Rosalind and also suddenly called out to her, causing the heroine to twitch and become very frightened. The maid turned out to be a disgruntled Ansoni, who indignantly asked the heroine why she was allowing herself to walk around the mansion in her pajamas. While Rosalina replied that she would not do so again, the maid was already dragging her into the room to tidy up. But even when the protagonist had already left the stairs, she was still curious about who was behind it all. Rosalind wants to know the real reason for the strange behavior of the maids in front of her. When the heroine found herself in another room where there was a large mirror, she decided to sit right in front of it without ceasing to admire her beauty. She gazed into her face from all sides, observing her eyes and hair. The girl admired her face from many different angles, which could not help but be noticed by the maid Ansoni, who looked at Rosalind with obvious incomprehension and fatigue. Continuing to do her job, which consisted of folding the clean clothes of the mistress, Ansoni turned to the protagonist and asked her if she would not get tired of admiring herself like that every day. In response, the narcissistic Rosalina turned around unhappily, as if showing her true gut. She waved her hand and angrily asked the maid what she was saying. Clenching her hand firmly into a fist and raising it above her head, the protagonist told the maid that not only would she not get tired, but she would not stop doing it for a day or a second as long as she lived in this world and saw the mirror in front of her. Mistress, delighted with herself, continued to stare into the mirror, enjoying her beauty and telling Ansoni that every day she looked at herself in a new way and it was beautiful. Ansoni didn't bother to say anything, continuing to work and agreeing with the heroine's words. However, Rosalind did stop spending hours admiring herself. Instead, she sat down on the table, telling Ansoni that she had something to discuss with her. The words of the heroine of the story made Ansoni quickly become more serious. The red-haired girl took her mind off her work a bit and turned her head towards the protagonist, then curiously asked her what exactly she was interested in and what the future conversation would be about. Rosalind looked thoughtfully toward the window, watching either the birds or the leaves and branches of the trees. She had confided to Ansoni that lately she had been having nightmares that were disturbing her and keeping her awake. This alarmed and angered Ansoni. Clearly showing her worries about Rosalind's well-being, she looked at the Manhwa heroine, holding a cloth and angrily asking her what exactly she was dreaming about. To fully understand what the sad Rosalina was trying to tell her, Ansoni decided to sit across from her, folding her arms and asking the heroine to tell her more about it so she could try to help her. Rosalina continued to look at a variety of objects in the room and out the window, starting her monologue by opening her eyes in a dream and finding herself in a place she was definitely seeing for the first time, a place she had never been in before. Remembering that very dream, which does not give the heroine rest, the girl continues to tell Ansoni that she not only finds herself in a new place, but shouts at some man in a burst of strong emotions. In the dream of the protagonist, this man has long blue hair and unusual clothes, as if he is a special person in society. At this man, Rosalina shouts in her dream, in addition, pointing a finger at him. The girl hesitates because of her memories. As she is in a dream for her, it is not just a man. Every time she raises her voice at him, she feels as if her heart is breaking. Besides, Rosalina can't remember what that unknown man called her. Rosalina continued to think about something of her own, but Ansoni, who had only listened to the fact that Rosalina was dreaming about a certain man she was yelling at, somehow became alert, which was evident from her facial expressions. Realizing something serious, something that clearly frightened her, Ansoni wanted to respond to the heroine's speculation by telling her what it could be, but she never got the chance to do so because Rosalind interrupted her. Without telling the maid the true reason for her intentions, the heroine of the Manhwa decided to suddenly inform Ansoni that she needed to go out, saying it in a tone as if she wanted to powder her nose or fix her hair. Ansoni could not even understand what she should do when in the middle of a conversation, Mrs. Rosalind Brighton suddenly tells her that she is leaving, without even hearing her opinion about the dreams that were troubling her. While Maid Ansoni continued to stare at Rosalind and wonder why the noble mistress suddenly wanted to go out, Rosalind herself had already told her that she only wanted to go out for a walk and think about things alone. Rosalina even put on a cape to hide her appearance, but Ansoni wasn't planning on keeping up with her, asking if she needed guards or a whole guard, which Rosalina actually hated. Already leaving the mansion, the girl was telling Ansoni that she didn't need any guards and would go for a walk alone, then return for dinner. The maid still couldn't get behind her, but at the same time she couldn't stop her. Rosalind even winked goodbye to Ansoni, holding the cloak she wore on her shoulders. So the noble lady said goodbye to the servant and left the Brighton mansion to get some fresh air and deepen her thoughts. After a while, the protagonist was already in a crowded market, where there were beautiful and tall, elegant buildings. The girl just wanted to take a walk, but at a good moment she noticed a familiar person nearby. Rosalina was already walking towards her acquaintance, saying to him with a sincere smile, Mole all the while thinking that the master of the Hennis Guild was a mysterious stranger who would rarely be seen by anyone. Appearing behind the unsurprised guild head, the girl finished her sentence, saying that despite that, he was quite easy to meet on the street. It seems that Artisian had already become so frequent with this girl that her appearance no longer surprised him. Duke Artisian, who for Rosaline is still the master of the Hennis Guild, turned to her while his assistant stood beside him. The man admitted that he just wanted to talk to her. The master even extended his hand to the heroine of the Manhwa like a true gentleman, telling the girl to come down to him as soon as possible. Rosalina was surprised at the behavior of her colleague, who appeared to be so kind to her. The palm of the polite man's hand was touched by Rosalind's palm, thus showing the fact that she now trusted him more firmly. The protagonist also replied to him that in that case she would of course go with him. The couple was already walking through the market, which was full of people and all kinds of goods, from food to souvenirs. Rosalina walked along with the guildmaster, asking what exactly brought him to the market this time. Guildmaster Hennis answered calmly, asking the lady if it wasn't logical for him to be in this place. After all, people only come here to start a new business. Hearing such words from a fellow business and business colleague, Rosalina blushed with happiness, asking the guildmaster if he was talking about what she was thinking about right now. That is their business together. But Artisian himself reacted as if he had once again failed to understand what his partner was trying to tell him. He looked at her in such a way that it made Rosalind shy from her own vivid emotions. The protagonist of the story once again checked with the guildmaster if he was now talking about their business together, which was what she was asking him. The girl said it awkwardly, as if drops of sweat were already dripping from her forehead down her face. Artisian looked at the heroine through the mask on his face and said nothing, as if he didn't understand a single word Rosalind said, but in fact he was too serious to act like the heroine, cheerfully and freely. After that, the pair decided to move from their seats after all, and the guildmaster was the first to go forward, leading Rosalina behind him. The protagonist of the manhwa did not stop asking her colleague what he was going to do now. Artisian answered that he would be engaged in market and real estate research. But the girl continued to admire the actions of the head of the guild, asking him if he would go to the market himself, without subordinates and guards. Artisian answered that if he would sit in the office for reports forever, he would go crazy. At one point, the girl also decided to become more serious and focused on the work, so she naively coughed, telling the master that their business would be successful, and then asked if he should examine everything so carefully. But the guildmaster asked her if she had just repeated his manner of speech. Wanting to teach Rosalina a little lesson, Duke Artisian pulled the hood over her so that the heroine of the story was frightened and indignant at the same time. He also did this so that none of the passers-by would accidentally recognize her. After that, the man also tied the hood on the girl with a strong bow so that it would in no way come off her head. Rosalina continued to resent him, not realizing why she was getting all this. The guildmaster pressed Rosalina close to him and began to shower her with his words, ordering her not to disappear suddenly, not to take off her hood, to stay close to him at all times, and to take at least 5 guards with her next time. The heroine was unhappy that her co-worker was grumbling too much. The man wanted to say something else about the noblewoman, but she was already answering him, saying that she understood everything perfectly, hoping that the guild master would leave her alone. The couple walked around the market and talked about their issues until the evening came. After strolling through the marketplace in the company of Guildmaster Hennes, the protagonist returned to the Brighton mansion only when it was already night outside, with only dark clouds and stars and a month overhead. No room was as quiet and peaceful as the one outside. An angry and irritated woman threw a wineglass at the wall, causing it to shatter loudly and terribly with large shards all over the room. Eliza, like the world's most evil snake, clutched her head in rage, unable to understand how it could have happened that her main ward was thrown into the dungeon when it was learned that she had tried to say and do something bad to Rosaline. Cringing with anger, Elise realizes that all her plans to banish the main character from her family are crumbling right before her eyes when she only had a small amount of time to put up with it. Thinking back to the very maid that the Duke recently ordered thrown into the dungeon, Eliza realizes alarmingly that Leodore still hasn't woken up, and her main mentor, almost her right-hand woman Dorothy, has been forced to sit behind bars. Eliza realizes that all these troubles have only happened because of Rosaline, who has just as suddenly appeared in their family as she disappeared years ago. The spiteful Duchess realizes she can't just let this go. Anxiously biting her fingers and nails, Eliza tries to come up with at least some sort of plan to keep things from falling apart. She doesn't understand if she needs to use more of something or if she doesn't, and it pisses her off incredibly. Suddenly, Eliza threw the wine bottle in the direction of her staff for the second time. The maids were greatly startled and screamed while the wine bottle also flew sharp shards all over the room. The Duchess shouted to her minions to get away. Noticing the fact that the maids were leaving her room too slowly and not at all briskly out of fright, Eliza looked at them like a hissing snake and asked why they were always so slow like slugs. Unable to stand it, Eliza grabbed one of her maids by the hair out of anger, roughly clenching it into a fist, which made the girl scream, begging her mistress not to touch her. But to Eliza, maids are just slaves who must obey her. The red-haired maid kept begging her disgruntled mistress to leave her alone, but she was already dragging her to the door, angrily telling her that she was absolutely useless. Eliza then let go of the girl's hair, causing her to fall painfully to the hallway floor, where another terrified maid was already standing there. Eliza didn't even feel any regret or understanding for the maids. Eliza turned around and left for her room, slamming the door loudly behind her, but the 2 maids, who remained in the hallway, could not recover from the shock and fear of an overbearing and evil mistress like Duchess Eliza. The red-haired girl's friend was anxiously asking her if she was all right, and if something was hurting her, also helping her to get to her feet after Eliza's manhandling. But they didn't even realize that in the hallway stood the person who had been watching them all this time, This mysterious person turned out to be the protagonist of the story, who looked angrily at the maids, realizing that Eliza is clearly hiding something from her. She's glad to have finally found her lair, but Eliza herself wasn't wasting any time either. She walked closer to the nightstand, looking down at it and thinking about the fact that she had also found something that would greatly benefit her in the future. Opening one compartment, the woman who was angry with Rosalina saw in it 3 uncomplicated jars that looked rather ordinary. But to Eliza, they were not just special, but crucial to the insidious plan. Eliza even took one jar in her hands, examining the strange, light-colored liquid that was in it. For the Duchess, this was the item that would help her win the confrontation against the main character of the story. Staring intently into the liquid as if it were magical and would solve all her problems, the criminal Eliza was saying aloud to Rosalind that she would deal with her as if she were right there with her and could hear her. But that doesn't scare Rosalina. She's also going to deal with her and what she's doing in her father's castle, so she decides to remember the strange behavior of the maids outside her room so she can leave later and pretend it never happened. The day after the disturbing events, Rosalind enjoyed a hot bath in her room like a princess. The girl's pink hair lay beautifully on the main character's body as the girl herself fixed it while surrounded by soap bubbles from the bubble bath. The girl leaned relaxedly against the edge of the tub, sighing at the pleasant and hot water. For Rosalind, this was exactly what she had wanted throughout these difficult days. At this time, Ansoni walked past the protagonist's bathroom, carrying her clothes in her hands to wash and dry as usual. But when she heard Rosalind's strange words from the bathtub, the wrong thoughts ran through the maid's mind. But the protagonist of the story was not going to relax because she still has a lot to think about. She cannot get out of her head what she saw and heard late last night. For starters, the girl decided to fully recall the biography of the one who now allows herself to toss the maids around and tell them who is worthy of being in the castle and who isn't. Eliza Brightman. Looking back at the story of the original novel, Rosalind realizes that after her mother's death, she perhaps benefited the most. She was promoted from maid right away to Duchess, which is actually quite amazing. However, this has not been a salvation for the family, especially for little Rosalind. Because Eliza, as the only witness to everything that happened, brought the little heroine's reputation down to rock bottom, causing everyone to constantly point fingers and judge her. But no matter how evil Eliza was, she tried to take care of Leodore, calling him almost her own son, constantly visiting him and asking about his well-being, even though he was not her biological child. The Duchess also cared for Rosalind, but unlike Leodore, she did not love her as much. Sometimes she would come up to her and also ask her how she was feeling, offering to drink tea or do something else. Realizing all of this, Rosalind was tiredly submerged under the bathtub water, thinking that it was all too complicated and confusing to accuse Elise of anything that Rosalind supposedly suspected her of. However, presenting the face of the very Eliza who almost always carries a fan with her, Rosalina does not realize what this mysterious situation she saw yesterday is, and whether all of Eliza's actions are really just an act for publicity. All these thoughts made the main character a little wary, because she does not even know what to expect from a woman who is so unpredictable. But the girl closed her eyes, trying to cheer herself up with the thoughts that you cannot so easy to just let loose and be afraid of this man, because only she will be able to resist her. Even after a while, when the heroine imagined herself in familiar clothes, she could not cope with the excitement, from which at one point fell to the floor, trying to get into her head that her whole life in the world of the novel depends only on her choice. Putting her hand under her nose, Rosalina emphasized the fact that she had to act decisively, and right now it was worth starting somewhere. With these thoughts in mind, the girl reached out to a single sheet of paper that lay nearby on the coffee table. Rosalina picked up the one that looked most like an invitation to some holiday or event. It turned out to be an invitation to a tea party to be held soon in the garden of the mansion. The girl raised the leaf in front of her, reading it carefully and continuing to enjoy her bath. After a while of bathing, Rosalind decided to go to the tea party after all, which made the supposedly gentle Eliza tearful. She wiped her tears with a handkerchief, thanking the heroine for coming. Eliza confessed to Rosalind that she was very happy that she was coming to the tea party, so she told the others, but no one else came but them. All these words from the Duchess sounded quite strange. Rosalind immediately noticed the colorful desserts on the table while a distraught Eliza said that she had prepared all this just for the picnic. diligently preparing. Still wiping tears from her eyes, Eliza even admitted that she couldn't handle the responsibilities of being Rosalina's mother that she was trying to fulfill. But the protagonist of the manhwa replied with a smile to the Duchess that everything is fine now. Rosalina decided to give Eliza her kind smile, informing her that, in that case, this party would be for two. In addition, the girl was holding a vase of flowers, which the heroine called a gift for Eliza. Eliza even closed her eyes at Rosalind's kindness, admitting that it was a real surprise for her. While the heroine was drinking tea, Eliza confessed to her interlocutor that she could have spoiled her so much and not given her such a sincere gift. In response to this, Rosalind only smiled. But the fun ended when the protagonist decided to ask Elliot about something important, showing the Duchess her sly smile. To the surprise of Elise, who was playing the usual curiosity, Rosalina immediately started the conversation by saying that she had recently heard something interesting. The Duchess was wary, realizing that the heroine wanted to talk about her bad deeds. But to Eliza's surprise, Rosalina set her cup of tea on a saucer and decided to talk about the very case of the fairy tree, asking her stepmother about it. Rosalind began to look at Eliza with serious eyes as if she knew everything ahead of time. She wanted to say that she wanted to know the details about it, but Eliza interrupted her at once. Suddenly, Duchess Eliza for some reason took Rosalind's hands in her own, touching them gently as if trying to distract her from her thoughts and appear kind in front of the girl. Playing sadness and sympathy, Eliza tried to portray sincerity, telling Rosalina not to take this situation personally. Lowering her head, Eliza also said that people are cruel nowadays, and so it was no surprise that society had acted cruelly towards her as a child. Rosalind continued to remain silent in surprise, as the Duchess said that even people's anger would not bring back the late Beatrice, so there was no point in worrying about it. But the stepmother's words still touched the delicate strings of Rosalind's heart, causing her to lower her head, hiding her tears and saying that she thought so. Suddenly, Rosalind swooped down on Eliza with a hug and words that she was the only one in the world who could understand her. This came as a real surprise to the Duchess, but she continued to play the role of the good stepmother. The protagonist covered her face with her hands while Eliza hugged her tightly and comforted her like her own daughter. But in that moment, Rosalind thought only that her expectations were confirmed. The protagonist remembered what this very woman had done to the maids last night. The maid was lying on the floor in fear, not even trying to get up. Rosalina realized that this woman was only playing to the audience. Rosalina also continued to play the sad princess who supposedly needs her late mother's attention. Hugging Eliza, the heroine asked her if she could call her mom from now on. The girl did not even realize with what face Eliza reacted to her words. A sharp, deep smile appeared on her stepmother's face, and her eyes became so happy and angry as if Rosalind had just fallen into her trap. Eliza replied to Rosalina that of course she could call her that. In fact, the protagonist was also acting for Eliza. She wasn't crying at all, but was scrutinizing one object on the table, while the Duchess lied to her about how her heart couldn't take such cuteness, and she loved her dearly. All the while, Rosalind was staring at the vase of flowers she had given Eliza before and placed it on the table. In its reflection, she noticed the most sly and devious smile in the world, which only confirmed her hunch that Eliza was evil. But Rosalind and Eliza didn't get to hug for long, as one of the maids was already rushing over to them, who clearly had some important news. She was calling out to the Duchess to tell her something important. When Eliza turned her head towards the maid, she told her that the Duke wanted to come here right now. Rosalind's stepmother was surprised by this, questioning the girl about it as if it were a real amazement to her. And as soon as the Duke of Brighton appeared at the tea party and sat down at the table, he pounded the table hard with his fist, asking the girls if indeed no one else had come to the tea party, to which many guests had been invited. The Duke of Brighton was very angry. He ordered one of the maids to bring the guest list immediately to see who exactly treats them so indifferently and who he will now treat differently. Angry Brighton, clenching his teeth, even said he would make everyone pay for it. But Eliza, who continued to play kind, was naively horrified at the Duke's words, calling him dear as if they were a loving couple. Eliza was so kind in the company of Rosalind and the Duke that she smiled constantly as she poured tea. She had made herself into the heroine's father's cup. Eliza calmed Brighton by telling him that one should not press the social circles in such a way. But it wasn't Eliza's words or Papa's anger that caught Rosalind's attention. She looked closely at the tea, for she heard a strange, pungent odor from it that she had never smelled anywhere before. It became very suspicious to her. Also, Rosalina noticed also that the color of this tea was very strange. She had never seen one before, much less know of any varieties that had such a color. Furthermore, this is the tea Eliza offers the Duke to drink. Duke Brighton was already drinking the tea while Rosalind decided to ask what kind of tea it was because it gave off a very unusual aroma. Brighton looked at the heroine, about to answer her question. Continuing to hold the cup with the strange tea in his hand, the Duke looked at Rosalind with a smile, telling his daughter that it was a healing tea that Eliza makes when he feels weak. The Duchess also smiled as she held the teapot in her hands. The heroine's father even asked if she wanted to try the healing tea, but Rosalind politely laughed, replying that she did not like medicines. In fact, the girl had too many questions for him to try it right away. After a cozy tea party with suspicious Eliza and kind Duke, Rosalina still could not sleep, clutching the pillow with her hands and thinking about what was this strange tea and not poison by chance. But Rosalind was more horrified by the fact that the Duchess, who was drinking something strange to the Duke, was also taking care of the sleeping Leodore, probably giving him to drink the same suspicious liquid. The girl squeezed the pillow even harder, realizing that she was in a difficult situation. She knows perfectly well that Eliza is a liar and a cheat, but she doesn't know what to do to make the truth come out and the criminals punished. Although Eliza shows herself as a kind stepmother who loves her children, Rosalina considers her to be a real poisonous snake who is plotting her deceitful plans right in her father's mansion. The heroine wonders how she can defeat her. Rosalind's excitement grew as she tried to think of at least something that would help her bring Eliza to the surface. But the lack of ideas in her head made her panic even more. But the girl was able to come up with at least some sort of plan to eliminate Eliza. She looked at the magic egg and remembered that she could be greatly helped by the fairy sign, for which she had recently visited her late mother's room. Rosalind stood in front of the magic egg, telling it that if it was so eager to awaken, now was the time to do so, and as soon as possible, so that the magic could help her in her fight with Eliza. The girl's words were heard. Right before Rosalina's eyes, the shell of the egg began to gradually crack, giving off a magical, bright light that also appeared the first time the girl came in contact with it. Rosalina herself looked at the egg with such astonished eyes, as if it were not just a miracle, but an anomaly happening in front of her. She did not expect that the fairy sign would hear her and immediately begin to fulfill her request. But the bright light from the egg greatly blinded the protagonist, from which she covered her eyes with her hand. The egg continued to emit such light that no eye could look at it. The heroine didn't even notice how the place where the egg had been continued to have an unusual glow, which meant the birth of a new magical creature into the world. The light penetrated even through the door, which looked a little strange and suspicious, but fortunately there were no strangers in the corridor, so Rosalina was not suspected of anything. After that, the bright and blinding light disappeared, while the protagonist of the story herself continued to kneel right in front of the magical object. She couldn't wait to see what came of it, but what was Rosalind's surprise when right in her palms appeared a small creature that seemed to show signs of life. The girl looked at the little creature with surprised eyes, watching its every movement. Rosalina carefully watched the little creature, which had small arms and legs, and yawned as if it had just woken up from a long sleep. The little fairy also had blue wings and the same blue hair. But as soon as the fairy opened her eyes, she saw Rosalind in front of her, from which she was greatly surprised, calling the girl a rose. For the little fairy joy that the main character finally awakened her from sleep. To the surprise of Rosalind herself, the fairy immediately asked her why she woke her up only now. But the heroine herself looked at the fairy with her mouth open, as if she had another miracle of the world and nature in front of her. However, what surprised the heroine even more was that the little fairy flew up to her, waving her little wings to hug her by the nose and tell her how long she had been waiting for this. The heroine didn't even take her eyes off the little creature. Rosalind was so surprised at the words of the little fairy that when she sat on her arm, she decided to ask her if she was really waiting for her so much. The kind fairy was actually more pleased with the protagonist than she had realized. She hugged Rosalind's fingers, telling her that it was true. But no matter how kind this fairy was, thanks to the novel, Rosalind knows what they are really like. Despite the fact that on the surface they are very kind, bright, like angels that have come down from heaven, in reality they are far more cruel than they seem at first glance. In the novel itself, in which the protagonist was reborn, they are described as evil spirits who are capable of much in view of their anger and cold-bloodedness. Remembering this, the girl imagined a devious smile on the face of the little fairy. As it turned out, it was such a little fairy gave Rosalind advice in the novel, telling her then to poison Daisy, then do something else. Because of this, the villain of the novel was constantly getting into trouble. Even when the villain of the novel, who wanted to kill Daisy, obeyed the fairy in everything, she was sentenced to death by beheading. Simply put, it was only because of the fairy that the heroine ran into trouble. Rosaline even remembered what the fairy had said to the villain of the novel when A was already awaiting her execution. Looking at her partner with a smile, the fairy admitted that she had waited a very long time for this, and she hoped that her death would be as painful as possible. So, no matter how kind and sweet the fairy is, in fact, in the world of Manhwa, she will always create trouble and chaos around her, because this is their secret nature and the meaning of existence, to create evil. But right now, the heroine of the story sees in front of her not a cunning and clever intruder who always wants to create chaos around him, but an ordinary magic fairy who smiles at her, showing how happy she is to see her. However, this is what upset the protagonist. She let the fairy go flying nearby while she herself was disappointed with the egg. She thought that in it lay a secret weapon that would help her, but in fact she got a fairy that would cause her problems. At this point, the fairy didn't understand Rosalina's reaction, so she peppered the girl with questions about whether she could hear her. But what surprised the fairy even more was that Rosalina just went to sleep in her bed, thinking that if she fell into sleep, all of this would go away. This really surprised the fairy, for she thought that someone needed her. Even when the protagonist woke up, the fairy was still next to her and was also sleeping. Rosalina couldn't figure out what to do with this little creature she had summoned, thinking it would help her. In the end, Rosalina decided to just ignore the little fairy that was constantly flying around her. Even when she was eating breakfast at 9 in the morning, it was as if she didn't notice the fairy who kept asking her why she couldn't see her. The fairy didn't relent and kept asking the heroine if she could hear her. The little fairy asked Rosalind if she could hear her, but the girl only scratched her ear, thinking that it was like a mosquito buzzing above her. But in the end, the heroine decided that all this could not be left so easily. She continued to remain silent, deciding that she had to use the fairy for her own purposes after all. While the fairy herself was frantically trying to reach Rosalind, calling her by name, the protagonist thought about the fact that this little creature could be dangerous to her, so she had best not react to her at first at all. With that decision, the girl was already in different clothes and place, sitting at the table and shoving the fairy aside, as if telling it not to fly right in front of her face. Also, Rosalina maintains a nonchalant face. This was noticed by the girl's father, who was sitting across the table. He asked the heroine if there were any gnats around, but Rosalina continued to maintain a look as if nothing embarrassed her. In fact, the girl tried not to even give the appearance when she perfectly observed that the fairy was trying to attract the attention and the Duke of Brighton, who does not really see or feel her. In order not to embarrass her dad, the girl replied, with a smile, that there was nothing wrong and he shouldn't be so worried about it. The girl also raised a mug of tea so that she was about to taste the drink. After that, the Duke of Brighton and Rosalind decided to start talking. Looking at the vase with beautiful red roses, the Duke was the first to say, Moll heard that she wanted to have a banquet soon. The girl was silent, which meant that she had. But when Rosalind held the cup in her hands, looking at it, the Duke of Brighton suddenly said that it was beautiful. The father of the heroine of the story explained his words by saying that he was pleased to see her trying to do something, even though no one had asked for it. The Duke would once again say that it was excellent while the heroine smiled at the compliments. The girl would have continued just smiling if at that moment she hadn't looked at her reflection in the tea, which also turned out to be strange. It had the same color that Eliza's tea had had when she had poured it for the Duke of Brighton. Also at this moment, the fairy watched with fear and excitement as Duke Brighton repeatedly drank the same tea that has a strange color and aroma. It seems that the fairy also guesses that there is something wrong with this drink. But what exactly is it? Immediately after that, the fairy flew up to Rosalind and whispered in her ear that she should stop the Duke now and ask him not to drink the tea, as it is very poisonous and bad for his health. Also, the protagonist heard from the fairy that it is not just tea, but akarosia tea, which does not cure but does not even strengthen the health of the aristocrat. Rosalind thought for a moment. She stared intently at the tea, which had a strange color. On the one hand, the fairy may be telling the truth, but on the other hand, the heroine simply cannot trust her because she is an evil fairy who only wants to bring trouble on her. The fairy kept shouting to the heroine to stop her father because he has already drunk 1 cup, but Rosalina kept thinking that she can't trust this little creature because it probably only wishes her bad. But what surprised Rosalina even more was that the Duke told her that he was ready to give her the nicest gift, so according to the Duke, if she wanted something, she could tell it to him. The heroine realized that this is a great chance for her. Taking advantage of the moment, the girl put her hand near the cup with tea and then said, "Mole very much want him to give her this tea." Of course, a father cannot refuse his own daughter in such a request. To explain her intentions to the Duke, Rosalina coughed a little and told her father with a smile that she needed this tea for the reason that recently she has become too bad. But the Duke was no more caught up in the fact that Rosalind wanted the tea than he was in the fact that Rosalind herself had told him of her poor condition. Brighton looked at his daughter in surprise, for this was simply shocking news to him. Frowning heavily, Duke Brighton asked his daughter if she was really feeling bad right now. The aristocrat even sweated with excitement because lately Rosalind means a lot to him. But after his own words, the Duke of Brighton hit himself on the head, upset that he was so shallow. He himself could guess what his daughter had been through and how hard it was for her now. After a while of spending time with her father, Rosalina went to another building near the mansion where she was meeting with the guildmaster for the umpteenth time. And it wasn't the first time Rosalina needed his help. On the table in front of the hero stood a whole jar with the very tea that the Duke drinks, considering it a medicine. It turned out that the girl decided to bring some tea to the guildmaster to find out if it was poisonous or not. The guildmaster held out to the protagonist a sheet of test results, which had a lot of text on it. Artisian said that this was what the lab was able to find out. Putting his hands on the table and joining them, Guildmaster Hennis also told the protagonist that this was not just tea, as she had assumed earlier, but akarosia poison. This is also what the fairy told Rosaline from the beginning. Akarosia in the Manhwa story is an unusual and very rare ancient plant that is usually well known to experienced doctors and herbalists, but not to ordinary people. After consuming it, there is a feeling that the body is energized, but it poisons the body. But if you consume akarosia in large quantities mixed with alcohol or tea, it can even lead to heart disease, which eventually leads to the death of the one who consumed it. Rosalina immediately pictured her father, who could have suffered a similar fate. Rosalina continued to read the analysis report carefully, realizing that this was what she had been thinking. And only now she confirmed her guesses, which, in addition, was created for her by the fairy. Even at this moment, the fairy was beside her and indignant, telling Rosalina that she was obligated to believe her. Continuing to look at the test results, Rosalina decided to ask the guild master if there was an antidote for akarosia. But the first to answer the girl's question was the fairy herself, crossing her arms and shouting to Rosalina that there was no such antidote in the world. But the protagonist was not even going to listen to the little partner. However, to Rosalina's surprise, the masked master also told her that nothing like this exists. The fairy once again forced the heroine only to find out the truth she was telling her in advance. Rosalina was leafing through the additional papers for the analysis report while the wizard approached her and told her that in her case, drinking the Etra potion was enough. The heroine replied that she understood her partner's words, occasionally glancing at the fairy beside her. But the cheek didn't end there. Rosalina did not come to the guildmaster empty-handed, but brought him a gift of various herbs in jars. Rosalina told Artesio that she was giving him all this because she noticed how tired he was at work. The girl also explained that these were not just herbs, but an expensive product that had been brought on ships from across the sea. But the silent Duke still does not understand the lady's real intentions. Leaning on his arm, Guildmaster Henne told the protagonist that he is very grateful to her, but he does not understand why he needs it all in such large quantities. Remembering the way Ansoni had a hard time closing all the jars of herbs in the large closet, Rosalina smilingly told the man not to worry about it because she had an immeasurable amount of them. To finally calm and cheer up the guild leader, Rosalina happily said that she even shared her herbs with Maurice, Artisian's right-hand man. She recalls that the boy was overjoyed at such a gift. Rosalind realized that all this time the fairy had been pretending to help by talking about the Akarosia, but not talking about the healing Zelia from it. But the fairy kept saying she wasn't doing that, and she was trying to warn her. But the fairy kept insisting on her point. She looked at Rosalind with the sweetest eyes so that she would at least look at her and believe a word she said, because before she said there was no such antidote. Noticing that Rosalind still looked at the fairy as if she were her enemy, the little creature was even more upset, having failed in her attempt to reach the heroine's mind. Meanwhile, Duke Artisian continued to stare at the jars of herbs Rosalina had given him. Guildmaster Hennis admitted that he was very grateful, but wasn't sure if his hands would get to it. Suddenly, the masked man rose from his seat, asking Rosalina where she was able to get all these herbs, which, according to her, are brought directly from the sea, which are also very expensive and of high quality. But the protagonist in response only loudly put another batch of expensive and useful herbs on the floor, telling the guildmaster that he didn't need to know that. Artisian could only stare at the desserts on the table, sighing sadly and telling the girl that he knew she would avoid answering. But what surprised Artisian even more was that the protagonist suddenly and loudly thanked him for all his services, and then said that she almost forgot to tell him something else. The girl raised her index finger upwards, emphasizing that her words would be very important. As it turned out, Rosalina had one request for the guildmaster. Rosalina said with a smile that in exchange for all of this, she just wanted to get one ticket to the upcoming gladiator fight that would be held in the Empire. The head of the guild could not refuse the protagonist. The very next day, the girl went to a dark and somewhat gloomy place where she bought the ticket and where the fights would be held. The cashier told her that the ticket had been successfully confirmed. The man behind the cash register handed Rosalina a ticket on which was written the name of the show, its time and venue. The girl took it in her hands. Also, when Rosalina was already leaving the cellar and the dark place, adjusting her hood, the man wished her one last time to have a good time. Rosalina made the decision to keep silent and just leave. This dark house is actually a place where fights between different gladiators take place all the time. The house is known for its spectacle and brutality. But despite all the unpredictability of the fights and the intrigue that the show creates, Rosalina knows how everything will end this evening. Even in the eyes of the heroine read joy. The girl knows that tonight will be won by a gladiator slave of unknown nationality and age. Rosalina knows that he has blue long hair and the same blue eyes. But the girl didn't have time to think anymore. She decided to enter the hall, where a huge giant was already fighting some brave gladiator, throwing him to the ground. After the fifth victory, the blue giant shouted with all his might, and the host of the show announced to the audience that the fifth gladiator in a row could not defeat this monster. The audience at this time shouted from their seats, adding more intrigue to the show, but unlike them, Rosalina was quieter. She sat quietly in her seat, keeping her hood up so she wouldn't be recognized. The host of the fight stood in the middle of the arena, shouting to the audience that after 5 fights the giant was even unharmed, and he did not know that he dared to defeat such a strong opponent. Meanwhile, behind the announcer's back, a cage slowly opened, releasing the next contestant, while the announcer himself solemnly announced his arrival to the audience. A foot stepped into the arena, which was shackled by a thick iron alloy. At that moment, the announcer told the audience to meet the new face of their unrivaled show. The gladiator slave that Rosalina had thought of earlier stood in the middle of the arena, while the show organizer loudly told the audience that his name was Kaye Strike. Noticing the fact that the gladiator had a not-too-amazing body shape, some of the spectators immediately started laughing, saying that he wouldn't be able to withstand even one punch from a healthy giant. On the other side of the arena, the spectators were also laughing with Kaye, not understanding how an ordinary slave could be allowed into the arena after all. He's just an ordinary weakling. But while the spectators were laughing, the speaker also said that to brighten up this duel, they had prepared a very unusual gift for everyone, which was held by a subordinate on a blue pillow. The speaker of the show proclaimed that the stone on the pillow is a fragment of healing. It must be a very important and precious thing if played out on the show. Rosalind looked at the stone as if it was what she was going to the show for. Her eyes sparkled with a new glare because it's an important thing to her too. But the gemstone was wanted by other audience members as well. Two men began to whisper earnestly among themselves, saying that this was the one stone that could save even a mortal wound. While Kaye was on his feet and getting ready, the announcer announced to the audience that there were 5 gladiators left today, including Kaye. But which gladiator on the count would be able to defeat the giant was a big intrigue. So the presenter also invited the audience to place a bet to find out who guessed and give him the prize of the evening, a fragment of healing. After the host's words, a girl approached Rosalina, asking the heroine if she wanted to make a bet. The girl was already reaching out her hand to the sheet to write it down, but she still kept her eyes on Kaye. The other spectators were already whispering about a certain fighter with the nickname of Bull, asking each other if he was still in the ring. Remembering how strong and invincible Bull was, the men kept talking about him, saying that he was the real star of the show. Rosalina was already writing down her bet while the announcer was repeating that the point of the bet was to guess which one Cole would come out to fight. After writing everything down, Rosalina gave the sheets to the Jensine while she thanked her for the girl agreeing to participate in the intriguing game. Kaye was also given a sword in her hand, after which the announcer said mole, no more delay, so he ordered everyone to start the fight immediately. Right after the start, Kaye leaned on his foot to rush towards the giant who has no idea what is going to happen to him. Holding his sword in one hand, Kaye ran at his opponent with such force that many gladiators could only envy him. Kaye seems to be more confident in his strength than the spectators. At the same time, the determined slave and gladiator simultaneously kept his eyes on the giant as if he was now his prey. The host also watched as Kaye fearlessly ran towards the huge beast, creating even more intrigue for the audience with the question of who would win the fight. The giant decided to strike first. He wanted to hit Kaye with his strong fist, but the slave of unknown nationality deftly dodged, continuing to run. Rosalina noticed it perfectly. She even adjusted her hood to get a better look at the blue-haired fighter, for he was very fast indeed. Also, the speed of the fighter was surprised by the other spectators who were sitting next to the main character. Rosalina was even more surprised by the fact that Kaye quickly and skillfully climbed on the giant, leaning only one foot on his big knee. Kaye himself was already preparing his long sword to deliver a great blow to the invincible giant. The huge beast did not have time to follow the blue-haired fighter. He was also surprised by his agility, but he did not want to lose to him. The giant was not going to give up. He waved his hand in the direction of the fighter, but this time Kaye managed to deftly dodge, so the giant didn't know what to do next. The giant had gotten a real tough nut to crack. This made Kaye's rival angry. He grumbled unhappily in the arena, not understanding why he was being beaten by someone who didn't look like he had any hopes. The giant kept his eyes on Kaye, hoping to kill him with a single sweep of his arm. But it took Kaye only a split second to leap directly above the giant and swing his sword at his head. All of the blue-haired fighter's actions are so polished and perfect that anyone can see it. A moment later, Kaye struck the giant with a blow that proved to be decisive in ending the fight. At that moment, Kaye's blue eyes lit up as if he were a true predator among humans. With only one swing of his sword, the giant immediately fell to the ground as the strength left his body. Kaye was only one strike enough to duck the hopes of the spectators that he was talentless and weak. The giant fell to the ground finally, creating a loud rumble. Kaye only had to watch as her opponent lay on the floor, not even making a scratch on his body or scaring him to death. The onlookers who had previously condemned Kaye and called him the ultimate lowlife were now watching him with their mouths open. They realized that in just one moment they had lost all the money they had bet on the giant's victory. The announcer solemnly announced that the outcome of the match was clear and complete because Kaye was the winner of the fight. The winner himself continued to stare at the giant's body, which was no longer showing signs of life. The blue-haired fighter wanted to leave the battlefield, but at the very last moment he decided to raise his head and look at a spectator who interested him. This very spectator turned out to be Rosalina. The protagonist also could not help but notice the gaze of the winner on herself. She was surprised, slightly removing the hood from her head to get a better look at the mysterious man. After Kaye's unforgettable fight with the giant, the girl was already on her way home, covering her face with her cape so that no one would look at her. much less recognize her. Rosalina couldn't forget the fact that Kaye was definitely looking at her. The intrusive thoughts even made Rosalina stop, not understanding why Kaye had chosen to look at her specifically and what his suspicious glance in her direction meant. However, the girl also tried to calm herself down while sweat from excitement ran down her face. Rosalina pondered the fact that this simply couldn't be happening. On the grounds of this, Rosalina decided to remember who Kaye really is. His real name is Calix Blake, and he is the sole heir to the Blake family who disappeared a very long time ago. Also, Rosalina remembered that, according to the story of the novel, at one point the main character, Daisy, comes to him and saves him from gladiatorial combat, even giving him happiness. And in fact, that is where the novel begins. It begins with the events in the house for gladiatorial fights, after which everything begins to happen gradually. The heroine understands this perfectly well. The girl continued walking down the dark street, thinking about the fact that when the story had not yet begun, she thought that it would be best not to come to the gladiatorial fights. Rosalina also realizes the fact that if she does even one thing wrong, Daisy's meeting with Kaye may never happen like in the original story of the novel. The girl's hand reaches into her secret pocket to pull out what Rosalina has been wishing for lately. The heroine of the story realizes that she just couldn't help but get the thing. In Rosalina's hand was a beautiful stone that magically shimmered with different colors. The heroine is already imagining how she will use the healing properties of this stone for her own purposes. But from admiring the graceful object, the girl was interrupted by a fairy, who flew closer to Rosalina and, pulling on her hood, asked to listen to her at least now. But what was noticeable to the fairy was that she was a little wary. The fairy had warned Rosalind that strange people had been following her for a long time. Behind the girl's back there were indeed 3 unknown people who were staring intently at the heroine. The 3 suspicious guys continued behind the lonely Rosalina even when the heroine quickened her pace. At first she wondered H= signed them exactly what they wanted, but then she realized for sure that their target was her. But for the protagonist, it didn't seem to be too surprising or scary. Her eyes read confidence and some indifference, as if she knew from the beginning that this was going to happen. Remembering how the presenter solemnly handed her the gem, Rosalina realized on the one hand that those men were not happy about it, and they were not going to miss the opportunity to get a rare, useful thing. But the thoughts of the protagonist were interrupted by one bandit from the group, who loudly told her to stop. Rosalina did so, trembling a little from surprise, but not turning to face them. Rosalina continued to remain calm because panic wouldn't help her in a situation like this. The girl looked away, listening carefully to what else the bullies would tell her. The heroine only had to stop, as unknown men with a smile asked her where she was in such a hurry. The men smiled as if Rosalina was already on their hook. One of the bullies even held out his hand to Rosalina, telling her to give them the healing fragment now, while the heroine of the story looked at them, half turned sideways. While Rosalina took her time answering the guys something, the bandits themselves started laughing at her and how stupid and naive she was to believe she was actually being given such a gift. The men continued to laugh at Rosalina, asking her if she really thought she would go home with such a piece of jewelry that some were willing to give their lives for. Rosalind still said nothing. She looked at the brigands without showing any anger or kindness, as if she was indifferent to what the boys were saying to her. Realizing that the girl does not want to make contact so easily, one man looked at Rosalina with a crazy and angry look, telling her to give the stone while they themselves are kind. But the protagonist was not intimidated by this. Rosalina continued to stand near the men, realizing what she already knew about it beforehand, for she had been given the rare treasure of this world suspiciously easily from the beginning. The girl turned to face the bullies, spreading her legs wide and preparing to speak words to them that would surely make them think twice about their actions. Without even knowing the name of those she was speaking to, Rosalina simply told them to listen to her. The girl began her story by saying that she did not know to the end how much they were paid to attack her. But what puzzled the Zelenans even more was that the girl showed 3 fingers right in front of them, with words to the effect that she would repay them 3 times what their boss had paid them to attack her. However, even such a lucrative offer didn't make the bandits change their minds. One of them looked at the heroine even more angrily, asking her what she was saying to them. The red-haired bully slowly pulled out a long dagger from under his clothes, telling Rosalind that they would be loyal to their master to the end, despite the money. The bandits did not change their minds even when Rosalina said she would pay them 4 times as much. The protagonist even had a ripe question, where such people get so much empty faith in their master. The girl squeezed her hand, realizing that she wouldn't be able to change their minds with huge money. Rosalina became visibly agitated. She did not know what to do, but at this moment she could not relax in any case, because she could lose not only money if something went wrong. The girl carefully watched the hands of the bully, who showed her his long and surely sharp knife, which he wanted to intimidate the already frightened heroine. Still, the protagonist had an extreme plan which she had envisioned from the beginning. Rosalina looked at her fairy, and after she nodded to her, the girl did it in return, hinting that right now it is necessary to act. After that, Rosalina showed the bullies her sly and equally embittered smile, as if they were about to pay for messing with her. The girl also let out an unkind, ironic laugh. Rosalina decided to pull out the very same gem from her pocket, asking the bandits with a smile if this was the item they were looking for from her. The stone continued to glow with a magical light, showing everyone its value. The girl continued to naively examine the healing fragment right in front of the guys, telling them that it was a priceless and legendary item that could cure any disease. After that, the protagonist of the novel squeezed the stone in her hand, clearly plotting something. She stopped saying something, intending to continue reporting something to the bandits afterward. The protagonist didn't just look at her rivals, but did so with a mocking smile, also asking their opinion on what would happen to them if they returned to their boss without the jewel. Rosalina continued to pepper the surprised ruffians with questions about whether their boss would refuse to cooperate, or whether, after such a crushing failure, he would finish them all off like the last animals on the farm. However, Rosalina suddenly became kind to the men, cheerfully lighting them up with her smile and telling them that she, unlike their boss, is a very good person, so she is going to return the stone to them. Immediately after that, Rosalina swung around as if trying to throw the stone in her hands straight to the bullies, or maybe even further. The seemingly fragile girl was able to throw the stone towards the bandits with such force that it quickly flew towards them, not even giving any of them a chance to catch it. The precious stone, on which the life of each of them directly depended, flew over the surprised hooligans like a bullet. They were incredibly surprised by it, but to Rosaline, it seems as if this stone is just an ordinary one. At the very end of the street, where no one was even standing anymore, the healing fragment was cleverly caught by a small fairy, which is so small that from afar, it seems to be just a blue light that just flies in the air. After the little creature was able to catch the pebble and pick it up, she, holding it in her hands, flew in the other direction, thus fulfilling Rosalind's plan. The amazed bullies couldn't even believe their eyes. Right before the eyes of all 3 boys, the rock fell into the pond outside, slowly sinking to the bottom. They hadn't actually seen any fairy, so it was a real surprise to them how far Rosalina could throw a rock. One bearded bandit along with another Zulashun shouted out in shock as to how the main character could have so much power, and if she was also a mercenary who had been hired to obtain the healing fragment. Deciding not to delay, all the men rushed into the water with words that this little pebble must be found as soon as possible, lest their master punish them for waiting too long. The bullies who had threatened Rosalind a couple minutes ago were now trying desperately to find the stone in the pond, encouraging themselves that it had to be done immediately or the boss would kill them. Because of this, they were all becoming very worried. And while the guys were busy searching for the healing fragment in the pond, Rosalina herself was about to leave, adjusting her hood so that no one would recognize or notice her. Meanwhile, the stone itself was slowly sinking to the bottom, shimmering with various shades of blue and blues. It seemed that no one would ever be able to find it at the bottom, but it turned out not to be so. Little hands were already reaching for the stone to lift it up and return it to its rightful owner. The little fairy was not afraid to dive to the deepest depths to help Rosalind with the healing fragment. She tried to hold it tightly in her hands, gradually surfacing from the bottom into the light. This was quite difficult for her, for the stone was very large for her body, but the little fairy did not give up, making every effort to surface and fly further. While the bullies continued to search for the healing fragment in the water, the fairy was already carrying the stone to Rosaline, asking someone why she should even do this for the main character if she is the one who should be valued and loved. However, the fairy was comforted by the thought that if she did it right, she could gain Rosalina's cherished approval and trust. The girl with wings is already imagining Rosalina apologizing for the misunderstanding, saying also that she is the best fairy ever. Having gained motivation, the fairy continued to fly towards the protagonist, flying closer and closer to her with the stone like a small light, while the heroine herself was looking in the opposite direction. Looking in the wrong direction, Rosalind kept looking up at the fairy who was supposed to come to her with the stone. But when she never appeared, Rosalina began to wonder what she was doing for so long. The protagonist got a little angry with the fairy because she began to assume that she had tricked her, just like in the book, by flying off with the jewel over the horizon. But at that moment, Rosalind heard a short squeak behind her that called out to her, calling her a rose. It was the fairy, who had no intention of betraying her friend. The girl immediately turned around upon hearing the familiar voice. Behind her, she noticed the same small blue light that flew towards her with the priceless stone. The fairy continued to hold the large pebble in her small hands, shouting to Rosalina that the thing was too big for her, and the healing fragment could have been found by the bullies even before her. The fairy herself seemed proud of herself for being able to do this. She happily showed Rosalina her stone, saying that she was able to carry it especially for her. But the protagonist of the manhwa, instead of 1,000 words, grabbed the little fairy in her palms, to which the enchantress was very surprised. In fact, Rosalina wants only one thing: to quickly protect the fairy with the stone until they are safe. Having squeezed the fairy with the stone in her hand, Rosalina already wanted to go away from the bullies and the unsafe place. But in time, she noticed a strange shadow, which came closer and closer to her. To the surprise of the protagonist, this person was not another robber or hooligan who wished her harm. In front of her stood Duke Artisian himself, covered in sweat, who thought about the fact that he even forgot to put on a mask when he rushed to Rosaline. The protagonist was as surprised by Artisian's appearance as much as his appearance. She looked down at him, trying to ask what he was doing here and what he needed. But Rosalina realized in time that time was not to be wasted on idle talk. She grabbed the Duke by the forearm, telling her ex-husband that he should run away from here as soon as possible. The girl continued to tug on Artisian's arm, urging him to come with her. Even when the Duke asked her why it was necessary to run away from here, the heroine replied that they simply did not have time for words. At this time, one of the ruffians was already guessing that the stone in the water was not so easy to find, and perhaps he was being tricked. His hands continued to be in the water while he himself could not control his anger. Staring into his own reflection of his angry face, the bully told himself that he had definitely seen the gem here, but now there wasn't even a spirit of it left. Because of his restless anger, the bully quickly turned his attention from the gem to Rosalina and Artisian, who were standing nearby and were about to flee. He looked at them as if he wished the worst for them. Rosalina was still urging her ex-husband to flee from this place, but the stubborn Artisian still wouldn't listen to her. Because of this, they involve even more trouble on themselves. Realizing that Rosalina could run away right now, the brown-haired bully frowned his eyebrows and hurried towards her while still in the pond. Not intending to take any more bullying, the bandit decided that he would put his cold weapon to practical use. On the basis of such thoughts, he swung his knife in the direction of the unsuspecting Rosalina. Shouting to the protagonist to get what she deserved, the bandit hurled his 2 daggers at Rosalina with all the force and anger he had for the girl. The 2 razor-sharp knives were already spinning toward Rosalina, with enough speed to prevent the girl from dodging or making a quick decision. Just noticing the knives, the protagonist seemed to freeze with fear, watching the blades fly closer and closer to her with each passing moment. But fortunately, Rosalina was not hurt. The blow was taken by Artisian, who covered the girl with his back, causing the blade of one of the bully's daggers to sink deeply into him. A while after such events, when rumors about it had already spread everywhere, Eliza smilingly asked the maid whether Rosalina had stabbed her husband because he had offered her a divorce. Laughing sincerely, Eliza even admitted that the story was the funniest she had ever heard. In fact, her daughter's tragedy was just an excuse for the arrogant Eliza to laugh. The mistress put on her red slippers, wishing she could stand up and telling the maids to mummer that it makes her laugh so much, to the point where she might go mad. But the Duchess turned the mirth in a moment, looking at the maid with unpleasant burgundy eyes and asking if this was confirmed information. The maid, who had been telling her this shocking and supposedly true news all along, coughed a little, not knowing what to answer. But while the maid was thinking, the Duchess was already stretching her arms out to the sides, which meant that she had to be put into a new dress immediately. Several maids immediately began dressing, embellishing, and fancying Eliza while she just stood there with her arms outstretched, saying to herself that no matter how it really was, it didn't matter to her. Eliza reached across the table afterward, telling the maids that it might be a lie to some extent, but the Duchess was still glad for this adventure with Rosalind. Eliza reached for a single leaf that lay on the round table. She also admitted that it was not only unimportant to her, but that social passions did not interest her in general. But, judging from the numerous letters that had been prepared especially for Eliza, one could assume a completely different thing, because the Duchess, more than anyone else, wants to know what is going on between the aristocrats, and especially Rosalind. Meanwhile, in the Duke of Fileston's mansion, the butler has already helped Artesio to wrap bandages around the wound, telling the nobleman that all work on the treatment is finished. The butler with the monocle still wouldn't stop talking, constantly inundating the Duke with advice on what to do to keep the wounds from bleeding and heal faster. But when the butler kept chattering about rest and something else, Artisian, putting on his clothes, simply told him to go, getting a little angry with the servant. The Duke's sullen demeanor could not help but be noticed by Rosalind, who was with him helping with his wounds. She was surprised that the Duke chased the butler away with advice as if he was stabbed every day. Also, Rosalind could not forget that before that he had beaten 2 people himself, trying to punish them for what they had done. Remembering the angry face of Artisian, the protagonist thought that at that moment she was very scared for her life, but the war hero, in the form of the Duke, came to her rescue. However, no matter what happened, the heroine is still curious about what exactly her ex-husband was doing there, and it was not because of her that he happened to be there, and in an overly suspicious way. At this time, while Rosalina was thinking, Duke Fileston turned to the girl and told her to maul if she made sure that everything was in order, she could go from here and not stand. Rosalina didn't plan on leaving. The Duke was also silent, creating an awkward pause and thinking about the fact that it didn't look like they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Because of the fact that the heroine uses the services of the Hennis Guild, they now see each other almost every day. For some reason, the agitated Duke wanted to tell the heroine what would happen if she stayed in this house even a little longer, but he was unable to get the final part of the sentence out the first time. It turns out that what the Duke meant was that if she stayed here, she would only get just a pathetic hope that there could still be something between them. Artisian's words surprised and angered Rosalind, but she decided not to give in to her emotions so easily, sighing quietly and preparing to comfort her interlocutor in some way. The Duke's face portrayed real surprise when Rosalina told him that now it was necessary to get into bed and then already talk about everything else. The girl even took Artisian by the sleeve to finally make him follow her. The protagonist did force the surprised Artisian to follow her, saying that right now he needed rest and nothing more. Rosalina even asked if he had heard her words. Rosalina once again reiterated the fact that he needed to rest without thinking about any problems, calling him her patient. The girl explained her position by saying that now the Duke was too hurt just because of her, and she was trying to redeem herself. At this time, Artisian was looking at the teapot that stood nearby. The protagonist was calmly pouring water from the teapot into a clear glass, admitting to the Duke that she felt responsible for what happened. The Duke was surprised and angered by the girl's words. He decided to clarify with Rosalind whether she said such a word as responsibility. The girl decided to sit down closer to Artisian, putting her hand on his chest and saying that she too knew the meaning of the word, just as he did. What surprised the Duke even more was that Rosalind ordered the Duke to listen to her attentively, afterwards saying that she understood perfectly well how difficult it was to see her as the former arrogant Rosalind. The heroine admitted that she is trying hard at changing herself. But also, the girl pointed her index finger at the Duke, still holding the glass of water and telling Artisian that he should be kind enough to encourage her. The girl continued to hold the glass of water in front of Artisian's face, telling him not to treat her harshly or rudely. The Duke only had to take the glass of water in his hand, turning away from the heroine and asking her what he would get out of it in return. Rosalind already seemed to know the answer to that question, for she had already told Artisian that she would get something special and important. Smiling sweetly, the girl said that such a special thing could be, for example, their calm and quiet divorce. After Rosalina visited Artisian and made sure he was okay, she returned to her mansion to check on someone. The protagonist was in a quiet and peaceful room, keeping her sad eyes on someone who had been in a perpetual slumber for the past year. Rosalina watched her sleeping brother named Leodore, wondering if he was surely cursed that he was now sleeping such a sound sleep. The heart of the protagonist felt something suspicious here. She looked at her brother with obvious worry and sympathy. Suddenly, a cheerful fairy appeared next to the heroine of the story, who arrived just in time. The little creature called out to the girl, as if asking what she was doing. The fairy decided to fly closer to Rosalind, hugging her cheek and asking her if she believed her now. Rosalina replied that she did and that she would not disregard her advice. But the pleasant moment in Rosalind's relationship with the fairy ended when the protagonist looked at her fire and asked her what she thought about Leodore. To the protagonist's surprise, the fairy shook her head for some reason, as if denying all of Rosalina's speculations from earlier, which were that it was the fairy who cursed Leodore. Rosalind was also surprised that the fairy she now trusted flew closer to the sleeping brother of the protagonist and said that it was not a fairy curse. Looking at the sleeping Leodore, the fairy added that it was most likely a blessing, as the leaf fairy was working hard to restore him. Rosalina continued to stare at Leodore while the fairy told her that the leaf fairy was making such a great effort that she couldn't manifest. But the girl's attention was also drawn to the strange tubes that were securely attached to her sleeping brother's arm. Rosalind realized that apparently, through these tubes, a medicine that supposedly cured him was entering Leodore's body. Looking at the thing that was near Leodore, the heroine decided to ask the fairy if she knew what it was. At this time, the fairy was calmly flying near her like a small, shining blue balloon. Also looking at the medicine which was supposed to cure Leodore, the fairy told her partner that it was not like that at all and it was a real poison, and very dangerous, highly poisoning the body. The fairy explained to the excited protagonist that it poisoned the blood and spoils it to such an extent that it leads to death, and in agony. Rosalind immediately pictured Leodore, who could no longer endure the pain and suffering. Rosalina was even more saddened by another fact. It turns out that all this time, the fairy was on the contrary, helping Leodore to survive instead of cursing him all these years. Rosalina realized that year after year, the native Eliza had lied to her about that as well. But the girl still had at least some hope in her heart that her brother would awaken from his eternal sleep. She held the healing fragment in her hand so that she could apply it to her brother now and see if he would wake up. The girl had too many hopes and worries that she was starting to believe that this one would never work out. She looked at the stone with sad eyes, as if asking it to help her. Rosalina let the stone touch the chest of the sleeping Leodore, and a magical light appeared in the room, which meant that the healing fragment was beginning to take effect. The girl let it happen, frowning and keeping her eyes on her brother, because for her it was the most important event in her life right now. If he didn't wake up, she wouldn't even know what to do next or what way to save him. But the fairy, who knew a little more about the magical properties of the stone and magic, immediately told the heroine that the magical power of the fragment is not enough for her brother to wake up. Realizing that the heroine would be very upset if it didn't work, the fairy flew up to her face and, touching her cheek, told her that only she could help. So far, Rosalina couldn't even understand what her partner meant. After that, the magical fairy flew closer to the stone and Leodore, starting to emit the same magical glow that came from the fragment. The heroine noticed that it really helps the magic to heal Leodora. Thus, the fairy touched the hand of the protagonist's sick brother, causing him to instantly recover from the deadly poison Eliza had been feeding him for decades. After the magic happened, Leodore's eyes didn't even seem to move, but in fact they became so alive it was as if he was about to open his eyelids and show the world his green eyes. That's exactly what happened. Leodore suddenly opened his eyes as if a great force was forcing him to do so right now. The healing fragment had worked, but without the fairy it wouldn't be able to help Leodore fully. Meanwhile, in another part of the Brighton mansion, Eliza was already actively discussing how often Rosalind was visiting the sleeping Leodore. She waved her fan playfully, glaring at the intimidated maid who had alerted her to the fact. Eliza even lounged aristocratically on the couch, placing her feet on it. In this posture, she was talking to her subordinates, asking one of them why on earth Rosalina was doing this. The servant girl, out of fear, doesn't even know the answer to this question. However, Ansoni, the girl who is the closest maid to Rosalind, fearfully replied to the mistress that it seems she is doing it to get the attention of the Duke of Brighton. At this difficult moment, Antony could not help but recall the words the protagonist had spoken to her when Rosalind was admiring herself in the mirror, recounting her strange dream about a man. At that time, Rosalina was still sitting on the chair, looking at Ansoni. Rosalina then clearly told her to always tell her what she didn't know. The heroine also advised Ansoni to put her safety first. Ansoni realizes that she must heed this advice. She has already been beaten by Eliza, and if she doesn't tell the truth now, there is no telling what the Duchess will even do to her. Ansoni cried from her predicament, preparing to tell her mistress the truth, or else a lie. Remembering the words of the protagonist, who herself had chosen to share this secret with her, Ansoni began to say that the reason she wanted to hold the jark was to show everyone that Leodore was showing no signs of waking up. Many tears fell from Ansoni's eyes to the floor as the maid tried to tell Elise at least something she had heard or resembled the truth. She didn't want to put herself in danger, something Rosalind herself had taught her. Ansoni continued to cry and tell the evil Duchess that the Brighton family had no suitable heir, so the gala would be the starting point for her to be that heir. The maid raised her head to her lord and told her the final summation of Rosalind's intentions. She wishes to correct her image and sees power in the Brighton family, but this is actually a blatant lie. To the surprise of all the maids present, Eliza reacted calmly, saying that it is all perfectly understandable and clearly there can be no other reason. Rosalina really wishes for it. However, Ansoni's words still hurt Eliza's enormous ego. She tried to clench her hand into a fist, calling Rosalina every possible word she knows, and showing by doing so how much she hates her. Eliza frowned with restrained rage, realizing only one thing. He wouldn't let her act the way she wanted. Also, the Duchess finally realized that Rosalind was no longer the same as before, and the game now needed to be played more thoughtfully and humanely. Eliza suddenly wanted to make a loud statement to all the maids present, ordering them to listen to her words immediately. She stood up from the couch, tapping the floor with her heels. Bright sunlight streamed into Eliza's room as she crossed her arms and contemplated her rival and her confrontation with her. She could no longer tolerate any more bullying on her part. Thinking it over carefully, Eliza turned her head toward the intimidated maids and told them that now the game would have to be played big. There was some mystery, terror, and cruelty in the Duchess's eyes, as always. It made the old Eliza remember her youth, or rather, the events that took place 5 years ago. She remembered very well how happy she had been when she became Duchess after Beatrice's death. That was the day she became Lady Brighton. Opening the boxes with all sorts of expensive jewelry, from bracelets to necklaces, Eliza couldn't get excited, because from that moment on, all those jewels were hers. Everything belonged to her. But in addition to monetary wealth, Eliza also gained marriage. She remembers the first time she called the Duke of Brighton dear, trying to get close to him with at least an embrace, for they were already husband and wife, according to Eliza. The woman only wanted to touch the Duke, imagining a happy family with him and many other good things. But the Duke had a completely different attitude towards Eliza after Beatrice's death. But just by feeling Eliza's hand on his clothes, the Duke of Brighton immediately jumped up from his seat, pulling his hand away from the woman as if she truly disgusted him. At that moment, Eliza realized everything. The Duke of Brighton didn't even want to look at his new wife, who was really nothing to him. He turned away from her, apologizing for this behavior, and was about to leave Eliza. Eliza saw her husband off with a look, not intending not to pursue or prove anything. It couldn't help but enter her head that the Duke of Brighton himself didn't want her by his side. That saddened her even more. From that moment on, Eliza knew no matter how many times she touched him or what she said, she would still get ignored by the Duke as if she was nothing to him. She gave him many chances, but every time Brighton missed them. She came up with new methods to get closer, but all of them the Duke ignored. Even when Eliza prepared all sorts of surprises for the Duke, Brighton still walked away from her, as was the case with the picnic. Eliza did not understand why she all this and how she can win his attention, but there was still someone in the family who could make the Duke look at himself. This person was Rosalind, who should only appear, as the Duke of Brighton immediately listened to her and fulfilled all requests. The girl was always as sweet to the Duke as Eliza herself, but when Rosalind asked him for something, the Duke couldn't help but turn around and ask her what exactly she was thinking or what she wanted from him. Eliza remembers how the Duke would immediately become agitated when Rosalind would only tell him that she needed to speak to him urgently. It was obvious that talking to his daughter was more important to the Duke than Eliza, and maybe that was the right thing to do. The Duchess recalls that Rosalind even copied her behavior and manner of speech when talking to her father. Rosalind would laugh and smile in her father's face, just saying that she wanted to ask him for something. Eliza continued to watch it all from the window of the mansion. She realizes that she will never be able to get the same trust and affection from the Duke as she did with Rosalind, and that fact has always hurt her soul. Because of this, Duchess Eliza vows to herself that she will never again allow Rosalind to act the way she wants, because in Eliza's opinion, she doesn't deserve it at all. Eliza will never forget the face of a happy Rosalind, who didn't even have to seek her father's attention. He envies her, but at the same time wishes she could feel like a duchess for just a moment. Meanwhile, in the present tense, everything was already going to the gala ball, which was organized by Rosalind herself. The banquet was held in a large, bright hall with plenty of lighting. On the large tables, the maids laid a variety of delicious desserts with strawberries or chocolate, which just the sight of them made the visitors hungry and drool. There were so many visitors walking around the hall. Every aristocrat was dressed up and richly, showing their status, and every lady and gentleman was sure to have a couple, which is the noble norm. Even at an event like this, there were gossipy women who didn't mind talking about all sorts of things. Thus, two young aristocrats were whispering to each other about whether or not Mrs. Filesden was at the ball. The friend of the gossipy one replied that she had just heard that she was the organizer of the fancy gala. Rumors were passed on very quickly, and the talk in the hall became more and more. Holding a glass of champagne in her hands, the girl's friend replied that they did not even know where the truth and lies were. Maybe Rosaline isn't even here, or maybe she still hasn't divorced Duke Artisian. On this, the girls decided to argue, continuing to walk around the hall and talk on a variety of topics, drinking a sip of expensive champagne each. While the girls were gossiping, another aristocrat with a blue mustache was surprised to notice a familiar person in the hall that he hadn't seen in a long time. He was surprised to say what kind of people had come to the banquet. The aristocrat named his friend Baron Mulliot, also asking him why he was dressed up like that today, since he usually doesn't do that. Walking towards the aristocrat was a fat noble with a bald spot on his head and a long red mustache adorning his face. In response to his questions, the Baron only corrected his mustache, telling his friend to be quiet and asking him if he himself did not know why he was so dressed up for this celebration. Gesturing with his hand, as if he were a king, and speaking the words with a smile, Baron Mulliot told his interlocutor that at this celebration he would definitely win Miss Fielsden's heart, and it could not be otherwise. But on this, the aristocrat with the blue mustache only sighed sadly, telling his friend to continue dreaming further. In fact, he has no idea how confident the Baron is in his charisma, looks, and attractiveness. In addition, the aristocrat asked his colleague how exactly he was going to bewitch the one who was clearly a demon, and from whom Duke Artisian himself had recently divorced. However, Baron Mulliot only wagged his index finger, telling the aristocrat that he didn't understand or listen to him at all. The Baron acts as if he knows ahead of time that he will marry Rosalind and get what he really wants. The Baron explained his intentions first of all by saying that Duke Filesden had offered as much as 5 million gold coins as compensation, and that's what Mulliot was going to go after. Wiping his hands like a fly, the Baron revealed his plan to the aristocrat, saying that if he married Rosalind, he would get all that money at once. At this moment, Mulliot had such a wide smile, as if he already had experience in this and confident in himself 100%. Holding a glass of champagne in his hands, the Baron solemnly said that he didn't care how bitchy Rosalina would be, because in his hands she would still be obedient like a pussycat on a leash. Raising his glass in front of him, the Baron smugly said that Mrs. Rosalina is more likely to be a face than a cat, but for him she will in any case become his wife and will walk under him always. At this moment, the Baron did not even realize that a lady beside him was pouring red wine into her glass, but she had no intention of drinking it, intending to do something very provocative. A moment later, a large amount of red wine poured directly from the glass onto the narcissistic baron, which surprised the man greatly and caused him to scream with surprise and discomfort. Barely opening one eye from shock, Baron Mulliot angrily and unhappily asked the nearest aristocrats who dared to do such a thing to him and who had such audacity. But the girl who supposedly accidentally poured all the wine from the glass right on the disgruntled baron's head naively apologized to Mulliot, as if mocking him. This girl turned out to be Mrs. Rosalina, who stared intently at the angry baron, explaining to him that she suddenly, for some reason, lost all her strength and dropped the glass on him. Furious at Rosalind's insolence, the baron immediately demanded an apology from the heroine of the story, calling her every possible word. But the girl continued to stare at Mulliot, saying that she, not he, should receive the apology. Saying this, the lady walked forward with her chin held high, showing the insolent Mulliot the one in charge at this feast of aristocrats. The baron didn't even have enough anger and rage at the protagonist. He angrily gritted his teeth, trying to call Madame Rosalind as low and hurtful as possible. In the end, the baron could not stand it and began to shout at the lady, saying that no one would want to take her in marriage. But at this point, the heroine switched to other thoughts, because of which she stopped hearing outsiders. The girl successfully recalled the fact that she got the tears of the wind, creating a magic crystal as well. The protagonist also recalled that she had gotten a lot of stones, getting also the Stone of Fate, for changing the fate of the heroine in the original. In addition, Rosalina did not forget about the fact that she eventually made friends with the fairies, who before that she considered as evil enemies, and all because of stereotypes. While the baron continued to yell at the girl, Mrs. Rosalina herself saw a system window in front of her that only she could see, and that offered her information from whomever she chose. Rosalina was able to access this option because she had accumulated enough fate energy. The heroine already knew who she would spend this ability on. She clicked on the system window, entering the name of the person who was now yelling at her and calling her all sorts of bad words in the world. After the girl asked the system to tell her all about Baron Mulliot, several system windows immediately appeared beside her, showing her all sorts of information about the abuser. After reading the main window in front of her, the heroine learned that the Baron's full name was Jonas Mulliot, and that he was Eliza Brighton's older brother. The only thing he dishes out is boasting that his younger sister married the Duke of Brighton. Rosalind looked at the Baron even more indignantly, realizing that he is older than even her father, even though he still wants to marry her. What made the protagonist of the story even more angry was the fact that, in fact, he is her uncle on her mother's side, but realizing even that, he still forces Rosalina to marry him. Covering her mouth as if she was about to vomit from the Baron, Rosalina only realized that there was no way she would marry him, even if her reputation was at rock bottom. At this point, Mulliot himself looked at the heroine and understood nothing. Noticing the supposedly insecure girl right in front of him, the Baron smugly said that if she had no date and touched his hand, he would deign to be her escort that evening. Rosalind wondered with anger what he was carrying. Having lied to her opponent about being the hostess of the ball, Rosalind loudly told this to the insolent Baron in an attempt to put him in his place. But also the protagonist lied about the fact that the presence of a partner for her is not necessary. Hearing this, the Baron was stunned, wondering how such a noble lady can say such a thing. When Rosalina noticed that the Baron didn't care about her words and couldn't get through to him, the protagonist angrily ordered the guards to take him, after which 2 large guards headed towards Mulliot. The guards had already taken the inadequate aristocrat outside the castle, but the Baron himself could not settle down, shouting at Rosaline that no one would want to marry her, a divorcee, because she had disgraced him in front of everyone. Baron Mulliot continued to threaten the girl, saying that he would tell the others and make Rosalind's reputation sink, but suddenly the fat man heard a low voice behind him saying that there was already a partner for Rosalind. The restless aristocrat continued to shout who would want to be the groom of such a restless and obedient bride, until he himself noticed that everyone present began to stare at him. Baron also became uncomfortable, so he asked people what was wrong. But then it came to the fat aristocrat's attention. Right behind him now stood someone who could order others to behead him or do something worse with a mere wave of his hand. It was the Duke of Artisian. While the Baron dared to look back, the Duke grudgingly clarified whether he was talking about him specifically when he indignantly grumbled that whoever would be a partner for Rosalind was a real idiot. Duke Filesden, dressed in luxurious, expensive robes with all sorts of jewelry, stood behind Mulliot and once again with an angry face, asked him if he was the one the Baron was talking about. The other aristocrats were also surprised. They looked at the Duke of Artisian with their mouths open, wondering why he was here after all. There were rumors that Rosalind had been divorced from him for a long time. The noble women waved their fans, creating even more gossip than before. They also do not understand who to believe to the end, because the events associated with Artisian and Rosaline every time become more interesting and curious. However, the protagonist at this time was trying to control her emotions. She stood with a stone face, wondering what she should do and why Artisian had come here at all, since she had not invited him here. Her thoughts calmed down a bit when she felt Duke Filesden's hand on her shoulder. Artisian wanted to protect the girl, showing everyone that she had a partner. But what surprised the protagonist even more was that Duke Artisian mockingly asked the Baron if he wanted to propose to his wife. Rosalind went into shock at her protector's acting, which was evident on her face. Realizing that he might feel very bad now, the Baron immediately got better, showing Duke Artisian his sweet face and telling him that it was just a joke and some misunderstanding that made him misunderstand him. However, Duke Filesden was not going to play games with the Baron. He kept a serious face, clarifying to the insolent and ill-mannered aristocrat whether he could also jokingly question his existence if he was so fond of having fun. Rosalind herself had already realized that she was about to witness a duel between two men, one of whom was clearly superior to the other. The heroine sighed tiredly, remembering that she herself could decide something. While the Duke did not take his evil eyes off the Baron, who was ready to run away from fear, Rosalina wasted no time and, with the help of system windows that only she can see, read new and interesting information about the Baron to use it against him. At one point, the girl found the right window with information for her plan. She began to carefully learn individual facts from the biography of the Baron, while he himself did not even suspect it. Meanwhile, Baron Mulliot was already kneeling in front of Rosalind and Artisian, begging them for mercy. The Duke called out to the fat lout, about to pronounce his verdict. Sweating from fear, Baron Mulliot tried to apologize, at least in words, to the protagonist, constantly stammering from fright and somehow pronouncing words. But it turns out that the heroine still wanted to teach him a lesson. The protagonist of the Manhwa made Duke Artisian's hand get off her shoulder, thus showing her own confidence and telling the offender that he should have apologized earlier, not just now. The girl decided to frighten the already intimidated Baron Mulliot even more by coming closer to him and asking about the brewing business that goes by the name of the Brighton family. The girl was interested in whether it was going well, which she asked the Baron, but he was unable to say a word out of fear. Rosalind continued to press Baron Mulliot, asking him a most uncomfortable question about the fact that all the money in the business went into his pocket only to pay his debts. Here the Baron realized that he had run into quite the wrong man. On the face of the astonished and intimidated Baron could see that he was more stunned by Rosalind's knowledge than by her bitchy character before. He looks at the protagonist in shock and asks her how she knows this information. But no matter how surprised and flustered the duplicitous Baron Mulliot was, the protagonist of the story continued to remain calm as she sighed and said the full name of the person about whom she was about to tell the truth. Rosalina Discipline began her story with the fact that she loudly informed everyone that this man, who now just begged for mercy and forgiveness as if he had done nothing wrong, was involved in human trafficking in order to close their own gambling debts. The heroine immediately imagined the unfortunate people in a cage, whose fate is controlled by this fat man.